800 years ago, Joy Boy tragically died, and his straw hat was passed on to someone else to inherit his will and legacy. Eventually, that dude also died and passed the hat on to a new dude who also died and passed it on to a third dude, and then approximately 35 to 40 dudes later, it was given to Gol D. Roger. Who gave Roger the straw hat? Why did Roger know a hell of a lot more about the truth of the world at the start of his journey than even we as readers know right now? And just how many Joy people have there been throughout history that Oda has been hinting at in the manga this whole time? This video was inspired by a discussion by Joygo, who asked this fascinating question and pointed out a couple of very interesting things about Roger that somehow have flown completely under the radar of the Western One Piece fanbase. So there will be a link to that video in the description, but let's start with the premise of mentorship. Luffy's mentor was Shanks, Shanks' mentor was Roger, and Roger's mentor was, well, we don't know. However, we do know that he has inherited will from someone for two reasons. Reason number the first. It has been recently confirmed that Joy Boy 800 years ago wore the straw hat, and it is very likely the same straw hat that we would go on to see grace Luffy's monkey head in the modern day. That hat came from Shanks, which came from Roger, and so Roger must have gotten it from someone else as well. And then reason number, the other one, even at the beginning of his journey, Roger knew a hell of a lot more than we do. For example, upon his initial meeting with Silvers Rayleigh, Roger stated that their meeting was fate and that they were going to turn the world upside down together, which is a very specific phrase that was also used as part of Whitebeard's final words. He stated that when the One Piece was found, the whole world will be turned upside down, thus fulfilling the goal that Roger had apparently had since the very beginning of his own personal Romance Dawn. And then there's a line from chapter 966, which has gone very much under the radar, where Roger is trying to seduce Kozuki Oden to accompany him, and he says this about their destination. The stories say that a vast treasure awaits on the final island, and the government says don't go there. That only makes the stories about treasure more believable. And let's be clear, Roger is not talking about Lodestar Island here. He's already been there. It's the final island in the New World that's accessible via a log pose. Instead, here Roger is referring to stories that have been told about the islands that would go on to be named Laugh Tale. And how insane is that? The fact that during Roger's lifetime, there were still people who knew enough about the legendary island to tell stories about it. They may not have known anything about Joy Boy and the Void Century, but somehow knowledge of Laugh Tale and its great treasure made its way to Roger. So there must have been at least one person who sparked Roger's interest here, in the same way that Roger would do for the world on a much larger scale via his execution, hoping that the one person who needed to hear this message would, being Luffy. Although funnily enough, Luffy is like the only person who didn't hear that message, and instead Luffy became a pirate because of Shanks, and is seeking the One Piece more or less incidentally in order to fulfill a greater dream and promise to his mentor. Roger wasn't like Luffy though. Roger was not completely oblivious to the greater purpose of his journey. And I believe that's because Roger's mentor comes from a period of history that we currently know even less about than the Void Century, and he was a member of what I refer to as the missing generation. If Roger was alive today, then he would be 77 years old, and we know a ton about his time as part of the legendary generation, which heavily focused on figures like Garp, Whitebeard, and Rocksteady Zebek. At one point, the fate of the planet was decided by this generation. Had Rocksteady Zebek prevailed, then we would be looking at a very different world today. We also know a huge amount about the awkward middle children of the Golden Age generation, which coalesced around the nexus points of Shanks, Big Mom, and Kaido, but also notably includes many of the warlords like Doflamingo, Gecko Moria, and Mihawk. These are our current, mostly washed up middle-aged pirates. They were there for the very start of the Great Age of piracy, but over time most of them crumbled and gave up on their dreams. And of course, the generation we know most about is the worst generation, given that they're the primary focus of One Piece, and the generation that Luffy belongs to. However, the generation that we know least about is the one that came directly before Roger's, which is the missing generation, and the one that would have contained Roger's mentor figure, the previous owner of the Straw Hat. Because right now we have a rather large gap in One Piece world history, because we can actually go back a generation before this one, with characters like Dr. Kureha and Dorian Broggy, but we know so few people in the gap between Kureha's generation and Roger's generation. And up until now, Oda has been keeping this time period deliberately vague. I say up until now because the most prominent character from the missing generation is currently Cloudy Clover, and it was revealed that during his generation, there was a great purge of D-Clan members, the victim of which was Clover's brother. Now, this is a purge that did not exist in any generation after Clover's, indicating that this was a very dark time, but also that something happened to instigate this. And my immediate thought is that almost 100 years ago, the will of D, as it does, caused a storm great enough for the world government to take incredibly drastic measures to eradicate this initial from the planet, perhaps started by Roger's mentor. That, or this was when Imu discovered the true meaning behind the D name and thus ordered the extermination of everyone with that middle initial. Because either way, it seems those with the D initial were pretty public about it up until around 100 years ago, and it's only recently become taboo enough that D clan members have had to start hiding their names, like Trafalgar Law was told to. But even after figuring that out, there was still one more hidden message in the Straw Hat. There's a lot of times in the series where Luffy is subject to what I would call very convenient fate. He tends to meet just the right person at just the right time to help him out of just the right situation that he can't get out of alone, many of which can be directly attributed to his choice of headwear. The Straw Hat itself isn't necessarily some sort of magical object filled with throbbing willpower of all the people who have worn it, but it is an incredibly strong and very loud signal that the person who is wearing it is someone that you are meant to help. A great example of this is during Reverse Mountain, when Crocus decided to be ever so helpful and gave the crew his only log pose so that they could navigate the Grand Line. Crocus said that it was thanks for helping Laboon, and that's probably partially true as well, but it was mostly for the sake of Roger, as he went on to reveal as the Straw Hats departed. And I want to linger on this a bit because this isn't just some casual choice to make either. This was a huge decision because Crocus is now effectively trapped at Reverse Mountain. He can't navigate anywhere. However, Crocus was happy to confine himself because he knew the meaning of the straw hat that Luffy was wearing. The same hat worn by Shanks, the same hat worn by Roger, and by Joy Boy. All of which Crocus would know as he discovered the truth of the world on Laugh Tale. And look, it wasn't just the hat. It was a combination of Luffy's personality whilst wearing the hat. But the hat gives Luffy some exclusive fate options that other people would not receive. For another example, I also think there's a fantastic chance that Dr. Kureha recognized the hat on Drum Island as well, given that she has a history with Roger, and Kureha was ever so helpful in providing the Straw Hats with a world-class reindeer doctor. In a way, I think the Straw Hat functions as a much more global scale version of the X that the crew marked on their arms during Alabasta. It's a signal designed only to be understood by those who know, even if the person wearing it is completely unaware of its meaning, as is the case with Luffy. It also makes it very easy to keep track of Joy Boy's inherited will, because everyone with this straw hat goes on to make a pretty big deal of themselves. Photos get taken and printed in newspapers, bounties, etc. So every previous generation with first-hand experience of whoever wore that hat in their generation knows exactly what they should be looking for. And this even extends to characters like Mihawk. On Baratie, he runs into some random group of nobody pirates, but he sees that they're Straw Hat, and after being suitably impressed by the resolves of both Luffy and Zoro, he immediately encourages them and does his part to push that dawn of the world slightly further. Again, without even necessarily knowing what he's doing. Mihawk probably doesn't have a great, if any, understanding of the will of D and the hidden history of the world, but he does have an understanding of Shanks. That hat meant something to Shanks, therefore Luffy, who is wearing the meaningful hat, also means something to Shanks. And now instantly, without even really needing to do anything, Luffy means something to Mihawk. He has made such a powerful ally through his choice of headwear. And as old as he may seem to us, Roger is actually one of the most recent recipients of the Straw Hat, and a small part of a legion of historical Joy people, another one of which may have been whoever woke up Emmett 200 years ago and caused that big kerfuffle on Marijois. So stay with me here because I'm going to very briefly talk about something that isn't One Piece, but I think it very effectively illustrates where One Piece is going. There's an episode of Doctor Who called Heaven Sent, which features the Doctor trapped in a loop of dying and having a new copy of himself taking the place of the old one, and this continues as it ends up taking over 4 billion years to escape the loop, with each new copy of the Doctor inheriting the work of the previous ones. And there's a point where each Doctor, apart from the final incarnation, realizes that they're going to die, but they do so willingly, knowing that there's hope for the next incarnation. That's what this Straw Hat business reminds me of, just on a much smaller 800-year scale. Working out generations isn't a perfect science, but the span of 800 years would give us somewhere around 40 generations, meaning that historically, it seems very likely that including Luffy, Shanks, and Roger, there have been at least 40 people who have inherited the legacy of this hat, with each of them doing what they can to slowly progress the eventual dawn of the world, and each of them inevitably, tragically coming to the realization that they will not see that dawn in their lifetime, but all dying with a sly smile, knowing that it will come to fruition in the future, knowing that if they just hold on, the morning sun will rise. That last part there is a lyric from Binks' Sake, and in the great words of Goldie Roger himself, inherited will, the flow of time, and the dreams of its people. These are things that cannot be stopped. As long as people continue to pursue the meaning of freedom, these things will never cease to be. That is one of the more iconic One Piece quotes. It very poetically describes the main themes of the series, but it's not poetry at all. This is just Roger literally stating the facts of the matter. Even though the world government have near complete authoritarian domain over the planet, they are powerless to stop this event from coming to fruition because it is the culmination of inherited will, inherited dreams, and the relentlessly powerful flow of time. And if the world can just hold on and keep using each generation to push those dreams, then the morning sun will rise. And whether they realize it or not, and it seems that every generation eventually does, that is what pushes each new owner of the Straw Hat to maximize their impact on history. Which I think is best displayed with Roger in Odin's flashback, when Crocus stated that Roger had at best a year left to live. Roger just laughed and said, "So you see, I've got to make my time left count." And Roger is also very mindful about his own humble place in this grand cycle. One fantastic moment to showcase this is when young Pedro asked to join Roger's crew, and Roger replied, "Listen kid, you're on the waiting list. See, everyone gets their turn, their time to shine. And when it comes around, you can help us." Pedro took this to mean that one day he would actually help Roger himself, but that's not what Roger meant when he used the word us. In this case, Roger was referring to everyone that had come before him, as well as everyone who would come after him as a collective, and that Pedro would one day be able to play a part in assisting them, which he did. Just as Roger said, Pedro got his time to shine quite literally in a very big explosion. But it goes deeper than that, because the will of D at certain points in One Piece almost seems eerily similar to an avatar cycle. This is rarely brought up, but there is a concept in One Piece known as the voices of the past. These voices were the focus of the scholars of Ohara, with Professor Clover mentioning in chapter 1120 to make sure that these voices of the past would be heard. And just like Roger's quote about will and dreams and time, this is generally assumed to be a lovely metaphor, the voices of the past simply being a recognition of history, evidence that someone once existed. But this one is also surprisingly literal. In fact, it was these voices that managed to guide Roger to Skypiea in order to discover the poneglyph within the Golden Bell of Shandora, a location that not even Enel, one of the greatest observation haki users in the series, could find. And Roger was very clear with what happened here. He said that finding his poneglyph was easy because it was, quote, just packed full of strong voices. And without even being able to read the text himself, he understood the general impression of what was on the poneglyph. Roger said it was a story of great power, and as it turned out, this is the poneglyph that revealed the ancient weapon Poseidon. Roger was given this information because he was able to hear the voices of the past. They were guiding him. At no point was he ever alone during this journey. Roger didn't have the sole responsibility of history on his shoulders. There was a millennia of voices guiding Roger to his ultimate destination. And it's probably no coincidence that Professor Clover, one of the only other people to mention the voices of the past, was also recently revealed to have been a member of the D-Clan. And it's very possible that Clover had the voice of all things and could hear the same thing that Roger could. Although the voice of all things isn't exclusive to the voices of the past, as mentioned in the name, it allows you to hear all of the things, but these past voices are a particularly helpful aspect of that. And from here, I would ask the following question. Is Luffy the final owner of the Straw Hat? Is he the last link in this millennia-long Straw Hat saga? The trend with the Straw Hat seems to be that it gets given to a character at the dawn of their adventure. Roger had the hat before acquiring even a single crew member, and then he passed it down to Shanks before Roger became a proper big shot, and so Shanks had the hat long before he even decided to form his own pirate crew, and again passed it down before he became an emperor. And it's almost like they did this intentionally, in order to avoid too much focus on the Straw Hat and allow it to continue to provide its hidden meaning. But Luffy doesn't fit with that trend for fairly obvious reasons. Luffy has made the Straw Hat so famous that no one in the world even refers to Luffy by his name. They all call him Straw Hat. So it's going to be pretty impossible to pass this hat on to the next generation with any sort of subtlety. But you could also argue that passing the hat down from here won't even be needed. After the dawn of the world is achieved, then that likely fulfills whatever purpose the hat was created to fill in the first place. But I don't think that will quite be the end. To bring things back to Alabasta, the marks on the arms of the Straw Hat served their purpose and allowed Vivi to stop the Civil War. However, the marks then went on to serve an unintentional and much more endearing purpose of being a mark of friendship. And the same thing could be true of the future of the Straw Hat. Its function is to help put an end to the millennia-long war that Imu has stated still isn't over. But that war will end, and from there the Straw Hat could take on a new meaning, something more suited to peacetime, and even be the beginning of another 1,000-year-long saga of dreams. The dawn of the world isn't what we thought, and in retrospect it seems almost painfully obvious, especially since Eiichiro Oda has laid out the secrets of this planet across 3 separate arcs now, including Wano, Water 7, and surprisingly, Long Ring Longland, which contains one of the biggest hidden in plain sight spoilers for the end of One Piece that so very few people notice, because if you look over there's an annoying fox commanding your attention. But the overall proposal of this theory is that we've been thinking about the dawn of the world in far too metaphorical of a manner. Dawn often being used to describe an intangible action of joy and harmony brought to the planet simultaneously, world peace, etc. Freedom and happiness, the stuff like that. And sure, that's all going to be part of it, but this theory suggests that the dawn of the world is going to be quite literal. Because with the revelation that the One Piece planet was subject to a great flood, we now know that over 90% of the world, potentially even closer to 99%, is currently submerged deep in the darkness of the ocean. And when it comes to water, big water, there are some locations which have access to light, notably Fishman Island, but that's explained as filtered light that reaches the seafloor via the roots of the sunlight tree Eve, a lovely piece of megaflora that we still have yet to fully gaze upon. But as we see when the Straw Hats dive down to get to Fishman Island, the vast majority of this planet sits in pitch black, the kind of darkness that not even Frankie's nipple lights could ever hope to illuminate. This level of the planet is referred to as the underworld. Ooh, spooky. And it has been left deliberately unexplored by Oda, and that's because it holds all of the secrets to the long-lost civilizations of this planet. So when we discuss the dawn of the world, what we could be referring to is a literal dawn, where sunlight manages to reach these areas of the planet for the first time in a millennia. Right now, 99% of this world is asleep. It's just chilling there in the dark, waiting to be discovered. So here's how, why, and a bunch of other question words answered. Before we move on, I want to say that the foundation of this video comes from another video by Mr. Morge. There'll be a link to it in the description, give it a watch, because he is incredibly on point. And my only criticism is that I think he's even more right than he realized at the time, which is what we're going to get into here. As we recently learned, the One Piece world we see today is but the remnant of a significantly larger and much more grand planet that was subject to an apocalyptic flood. So in regards to great flood ideas, many people are quick to point their fingers at their Christianity for inspiration, particularly because of the Noah, and there's a lot of other biblical elements in One Piece, like Bartholomew Kuma carrying his Bible. So I think it's a fair connection to make, and it may speak to Imu's motivation to have caused the great flood in the first place. In the Bible, it states, "So the Lord said, I will wipe from the face of the earth the human race I have created, and with them the animals, the birds, and the creatures that move along the ground. For I regret that I have made them." I don't think that's quite on point though, because the flood myth, it exists in so many religions and ever so many more mythological texts. However, the one that strikes me the most is actually from the Epic of Gilgamesh, aka the very first book ever written, where the highest god Enlil decides to destroy the world with a flood because humans have become, quote, too noisy. It has nothing to do with the wickedness or regret over what humanity is. It's just because those humans, mate, they're pretty annoying, which lines up pretty perfectly because that's usually the reason given for the cruelty of the world nobles who refer to themselves as gods. For example, Bartholomew Kuma's father was killed for the crime of being too noisy and mildly annoying. As mundane as it may be, that's where I think the motivation for this great flood came from. The fact that Imu simply found humans irritating, I mean, look at them, and then decided to purge them as best he could. Imu's design is of course based on the Umibozu, meaning sea priest, a creature that demands an offering from ships or it will sink them, much like how Imu and the world government demand a tribute from the islands in the One Piece world or he will destroy them. And while countless theories exist to explain what Imu looks like unsilhouetted, many of which electing to give him/her some pretty enormous capital knockers, because why not? But my favorite theory for Imu is that he's not silhouetted at all. This is just what he looks like because he's an Umibozu. But this whole flood twist was pretty blatantly hinted at with the introduction of the world nobles themselves. When they were first introduced, everyone jumped to the idea of astronauts. And that's fair because aliens do exist in One Piece. We've met a lot of them, and the world nobles may very well have heritage that comes from other planets or moons. But I think the Occam's razor is now firmly slicing the world nobles' attire as a reference to diving suits. If the sea levels rose about 200 meters in the span of a century, then I imagine that people would be perpetually terrified of being caught in a flood, and they may have preemptively decided to engineer these diving suits in the event of sudden unpredictable water levels. Again, this happened over the course of a century. So during the Void Century, you've now got multiple generations of what would become the world nobles growing up and not knowing what life was like without these diving suits. So by the time everyone packed up and moved to Marijois, we were at least 3 generations in, and everyone had forgotten the original purpose of the suits, instead claiming that they were designed so they didn't have to breathe the air of the masses, which is a cultural identity that has prevailed to this very day. But how did Imu cause the flood? Well, it's probably one of two things. Either through repeated use of the ancient weapons, at least one of which is confirmed to have a knock-on effect of raising sea levels, albeit slowly, or we could do it all in one go by building the Red Line. It's been speculated for decades now that the Red Line is an artificial continent, and building such a massive structure would displace the world's oceans and lead to most of it becoming submerged. Or both, it could be both. but Oda has never really showed us the true depths of these waters outside of Fishman Island. So as much as we've explored of this world, we still know startlingly little, which is why the Jinbei cover story stands out, because he actually goes on a journey through the sea in parts of the world that aren't Fishman Island, and along the way he discovers underwater ruins that are currently being used as a makeshift home for sea beasts. But unlike the Fishman Island infrastructure, they were not built for this purpose. They are the remains of an old and likely long-lost civilization that became victims of the Great Flood. And a point Mr. Morge brings up that I really like is the idea of adventure lust. Both Roger and Luffy set out to have the best adventure possible, and at the end of his journey, Roger realized that as much as he'd seen and done, there was still so much left to discover. And that's why he said he would have loved to have lived in Joy Boy's time, so that he could adventure through that 99% of the planet that is completely cut off to him in the modern day. And then when he's about to get executed, he says, "My treasure, why, it's right there. It's right where I and everyone else left it. This whole world, it is in one piece." It's long been speculated that the One Piece is the planet itself, just without the red line, therefore connecting all of the world's oceans and creating the All Blue, etc. However, this new idea is much more land focused. We're still connecting the world, but the idea is to make a lot of the ocean disappear, to drain it somehow, in order to reveal the ancient world and connect the One Piece that way, by reuniting all of these separate islands as one big continent, or continents plural. And in retrospect, so many arcs in One Piece directly tackle the theme of global isolation and a desire for connectivity. In his video, Mr. Morge speaks a lot about Wano, which I think is one of the better examples of this idea. However, in that video, I think he overlooked a very important arc, which is Long Ring Longland. When making theories, I think a lot of people just sort of skip this arc because they consider it one big gag, and there cannot be anything important in it apart from Kuzan at the end. He's pretty cool. But Long Ring Longland has everything. Oda laid out the concept for the entire One Piece world and its future right here, this early on in the series. Usually, Long Ring Longland is 10 separate islands in a ring shape separated by water. However, in reality, it is a single island where the vast majority of the landmass is covered in water, with the exception of once a year where the low tide reveals this hidden land for a couple of hours and allows free travel across the entire island. This is a microcosm of the One Piece world in general. We have a series of teeny tiny islands penetrating the sea, all inaccessible to one another, whilst in reality they are all connected by this vast land that exists underwater. And what the people of Long Ring Longland are waiting for is their equivalent of the dawn of the world. That one day a year where they receive the freedom to travel between the islands on foot, which very much plays into Luffy's personal idea of freedom. One of the main reasons why Luffy is a pirate is because any individual island is far too small and too stuffy for him, and even the most fun ones eventually become like a prison for him. And we'll get into this idea in a bit, but surely maximum freedom would mean being able to go wherever you want by foot. The idea that Luffy could travel the entire world without needing a navigator to get him across the dangerous waters. Back to Long Ring Longland specifically, there's also a surprisingly touching story between Tonjit and his horse, Shelly. For 10 years, everyone else in the village left the island to continue migrating. However, Shelly remained behind and waited for Tonjit, who was stuck on bamboo stilts for 10 years that continued growing far, far into the sky, thus making Tonjit and the sun best friends, or at least housemates. Luffy even said that the stilts were so tall that he couldn't see the top. And what I'm getting at here is that Tonjit is the world's worst Joy Boy metaphor. Long ago, he vanished from Long Ring Longland. No one knew where he went, but Shelly decided to wait for his return. We even get a montage going through the seasons of this poor horse alone in the rain and the snow and the such, and going through all of the misery it is that the world at large is currently experiencing in the absence of Joy Boy. But very importantly, Shelly never lost hope. Shelly knew that Tonjit would return one day, just as the world knows that Joy Boy will return one day, and that Tonjit did. So Shelly's own personal sun god fell from his bamboo stilts in the sky and reignited joy within her. And while they're riding, Shelly even starts singing, and Tonjit makes a promise to her that they will cross the sea together and do all sorts of freedom-related things. And Tonjit himself is a complete goofball on a scale that can even outdo Luffy. Like when he couldn't find his 10-year-old milk. The only thing he could find was his mysterious cheese that just appeared out of nowhere. Tonjit always makes me smile, and that is the key quality of a Joy Boy. And I don't mean this as a joke. I think that what Oda has done throughout many arcs in One Piece is beta test his idea for the world at large. But also, I do mean it as a joke because in the end, Oda's mission is to make us smile. The most ridiculous thing you can think of can and will be possible. But the more recent and more obvious example of a global microcosm is of course Wano. Of every island in One Piece, Wano is absolutely the craziest, if only because it's a fusion of every major island climate type that you can encounter in the Grand Line. And it even has these huge artificial walls built around it, which reflects the potentially artificial nature of the Red Line, which we'll touch on later because that becomes very important. Unlike Long Ring Longland, these areas of Wano aren't separated. That's because Wano itself is meant to represent a different idea. Because much like the grander world, Wano was commandeered by these bad, evil ruler people, Kaido, the man with actual power like Imu, and Kurozumi Orochi, a beneficiary of said power like the world nobles. With Kaido's ultimate plan being to do a purge of Wano by dropping an island on the capital, and many of Wano's residents waiting and praying for a day in the future where Kaido's defeat occurs and a new dawn graces Wano, as predicted by the prophecy of Kozuki Toki. Like the moon, you are ignorant of the dawn. If there is one ardent wish that must be fulfilled, it will be when 9 shadows are cast, woven together through 20 years of moonlit nights. Only then shall you understand the radiance of dawn. So Wano was waiting for its own equivalent of Joy Boy. And while I guess Joy Boy did literally rock up in the form of Luffy, the person Wano was actually waiting for was Kozuki Momonosuke, who, like Joy Boy, disappeared long ago and then reappeared to save Wano and bring about a new dawn for the country. One Piece is full of Joy Boys and Joy Girls. In fact, pretty much every island in dire need has had their own specific Joy person, a Joy person that wasn't a member of the Straw Hats. With Alabasta, that was Princess Vivi. Yes, Luffy and the Straw Hats were responsible for defeating that nasty crocodile, but Vivi was the heart of the country. It was her who recruited the Straw Hats to save Alabasta from tyranny, and it was her that ultimately stopped the war. And for another example, on Dressrosa, there are multiple Joy folk in the Riku dynasty, and this one is especially potent because Doflamingo, a former world noble, commandeered the island and made everyone believe that the Riku family were evil demons, much like the world nobles do with those who possess the will of D. Every island has its own personal arc savior, their own mini Joy people, but the greater world and continent that those islands are a part of have a much grander savior in Luffy. Moving to Water 7, this island is in a very unique position because it makes commentary on the real issue of scarce resources and paints a picture of a very bad end for the entire planet. Water 7 is of course a very unfortunate island because there is no actual land left. All of Water 7 is a man-made structure. It is buildings built on other buildings. They don't have natural land to do things like plant trees to produce wood and such, which is difficult because their main industry is shipbuilding, which in Tom's day led to a dystopian outcome where the shipwrights were fighting amongst themselves for survival because the island was so isolated and resources were so scarce. And Tom's solution to that problem was the sea train. He was going to bring a new dawn to Water 7 by connecting it to other islands in order to assist with trade and give everyone the freedom to cross the ocean. After the sea train is completed, the narrator says, in this city suffocating in isolation, the people got aboard and the sea train puffing Tom crossed the ocean. Suffocating is a very important word there. It's a word that comes up every now and then in One Piece because it's very specific language that Oda likes to use in key situations. The immediate example that comes to mind is on Dressrosa, where Luffy stated that Doflamingo's actions were suffocating him and that he was going to kick his flamingo butt in order to be free again. That's what's happening all over the world. Individual islands on this planet are suffocating, and none of them can reach their full potential of freedom without help from the others, which makes narrative sense given that these islands are all fragments of the same continent, or again continents plural, so they are all very much small pieces of one bigger puzzle that cannot be formed without one another. It's crazy, but Oda has been hitting us over the head with this idea for decades, and it's only just now really starting to take tangible form. To Luffy, the world as it is suffocating, and if his desire is to have as much freedom as possible, then we need to drain this ocean. We need to connect every island on this planet in one piece, so that Luffy can go anywhere he wants, whenever he wants to. Now, one way of doing this, which is easier said than done, would be to get rid of the Red Line, after which point the world's oceans would naturally return to their original levels. Mr. Morge suggested that this could be the result of Imu's power. If he was to create the Red Line with some sort of ability, then defeating Imu, much like defeating other Devil Fruit users, could lead to the immediate disappearance of the Red Line. I don't know if it's that simple though, but what I do know is that this would be such a brilliant ending to One Piece, because Luffy's journey would continue. We've spent a quarter of a century exploring less than 1% of this world, and so when the dawn of the world comes about and sunlight touches this lost 99%, if I were Luffy, my immediate desire would be to explore. And that's the end. Luffy goes off on his never-ending journey and achieves the maximum amount of freedom that he has been fighting for this entire time. And for us as readers and watchers, even though the story is over, the world of One Piece still remains every bit as magical and mysterious as it was at the very beginning, because there's no telling what sort of strange and amazing things this planet still has hidden from us. The final war is about to happen. Each faction is preparing for fictional fight battling, pirates are pirating, revolutionaries are revolting, and warlords are out, well, you know, what actually are they doing? They themselves are not sure because they're in a bit of an awkward position. After having been cut off from the bountiful teat of the world government, the warlords now need to source their sustenance elsewhere. Hence the formation of Crossguild, a haven for the politically homeless, rejected by the Marines, not on board with the cause enough to become revolutionaries, and are too lacking in their own right to make it on their own as pirates in the New World. Now, I should also say that One Piece is a series where the world government are the cause of almost every single problem, especially their own. And so the creation of Crossguild is very much a reckoning of world government decision-making. After deciding to dissolve the warlords, Crossguild is now an alliance of 3 of those former warlords, 2 of which were unceremoniously cut loose and immediately attacked. Very rude. And a lot of people have had some very wild ideas of who's going to join Crossguild in the future, but if there are more members, I believe that there'll be former warlords, and that what we could end up with is an entire pirate crew made up of 7 warlords of the sea, which would end up constructing the single most powerful pirate crew since the Rocks Pirates. And the crazy thing is that almost each and every former warlord has a reason to join Crossguild. The only exceptions to this being Blackbeard and Jinbei, however, they are quite unique because they were also the only 2 members to resign from the 7 warlords, whereas every other member had their title revoked. So thematically, Blackbeard and Jinbei have always been separated from their peers, but everyone else has at least one thing in common, which is a deep grudge against the world government for stripping them, metaphorically with their titles and such, and in at least 4 cases, quite literally. But the first and most flamboyant of candidates to discuss is the ever-cackling Doflamingo, a man who is not done in this story. Oda generally does one of 2 things with former villains. He either discards them and forgets about them like Kuro, or he has them go off and conduct their own adventures that we keep track of. And Doflamingo falls into the second category. Every time there's a major global event, one of Oda's mandatory stops is an Impel Down to see Doflamingo having a bit of a lull at a very serious newspaper. And he's also a character who often provides surprisingly integral information, such as informing Magellan that most cities on this planet would be wiped out with a sea level rise of 5 meters and that perhaps they should be moving to higher ground right now, lest all of Impel Down be completely submerged. And there is some potential foreshadowing for him joining Crossguild. During Marineford, Doflamingo did suggest that both he and Crocodile team up, to which Crocodile said, yeah, nah, and then it didn't happen. But maybe this time around the answer will be, nah, yeah. And a second Impel Down jailbreak will almost certainly happen. One, because Bon Clay is the current queen of level 5.5, with Emporio Ivankov originally having been planted there by the Revolutionary Army for some sort of grand plot, and that grand plot still exists. But even then, there's going to need to be a prison break real soon out of sheer necessity. Most of Impel Down is already underwater, but the entrance is above water, but not a lot of it, and it'll be completely submerged in no time if Imu keeps insisting that an increasingly large list of things never existed. And if I were to put myself in the surprisingly mundane shoes of the world nobles. I don't wear very fancy shoes, but if I was inside them, then my bet would be that the solution to this problem of the sea levels rising would be to just abandon Impel Down. Both the prisoners and the guards, because to a world noble, what's the difference? So we could see a situation where there could be a combined breakout of prisoners and guards rebelling against the world government together, which is very bad news for Magellan's agoraphobia, as he would be forced to go outside. But once he's out, where's Doflamingo gonna go? He's been rejected by the world nobles, he's lost his pirate empire, the one emperor of the sea that he was cuddling up to got monkey punched into magma, so where else could one go to make use of his warlord credentials than Crossguild? And I'd say very much the same for Gecko Moria, who feels like the most obvious candidate for me. He's had a very rough time since the events of Thriller Bark, where all of his sedentary hopes and dreams were shattered once more, and despite his plan to create a new crew of zombies to make sure that he never has to feel the pain of losing his crew again, he went and lost his crew again, and is feeling many pains because Absalom was killed by the Blackbeard pirates. However, even though we didn't see him, Moria did end up escaping Hachinosu during the sword raid. And realistically, what else is this big boy gonna do? He probably wants revenge against Blackbeard, he despises Luffy, the world government have rejected him, and Shanks doesn't have enough room on the Red Force for Moria's enormous behind. But do you know where we do have space? That's right. Buggy's flagship at the big top, it's even got big in the name. But the main reason reason why I think that Moria is more or less a lock for Crossguild is because of Perona. Because if Perona needs to run to safety, then the obvious person to go to is Mihawk, because he tolerates her for very easy to see reasons. But if Moria was to rock up, and I imagine that the rest of Crossguild would probably embrace him with open arms. Because Mihawk aside, Crossguild seems to function as a bit of a support group for characters who have been beaten by Luffy, and Moria's not weak. He gets clowned on a lot, by me, admittedly, but he's an insanely useful dude to have around. With the mind of Crocodile and the flashiness of Buggy, I think that Moria could be put to quite devastating use, and if anyone deserves a very violent redemption, I do think it's Moria. After the Paramount War, the world government tried to have him assassinated, so I would love to see him rock up to the final war and punch each of the 5 elders in the dick, both metaphorically and literally. And if both Moria and Doflamingo were to join, then I think that would be a fun interaction as well, because the world government sent Doflamingo to assassinate Moria. Awkward. And as a side note, Doflamingo is currently expecting to be assassinated in prison because he knows too much about assorted world noble secrets, so he and Moria do probably have quite a bit to bond over in that regard. And this trauma bonding is very important because that is the core aspect that links every former warlord of the sea. With the one that I'm personally most interested in right now being Boa Hancock, because it's very hard to predict what her actions are going to be. Hancock is in a very unique situation because she still has a kingdom to protect, and every other warlord that did have territory of their own to hold have since lost it, and so they're able to act as free bowling agents. But with Amazon Lily, that was recently invaded by both Blackbeard and the Marines at the same time, a chaotic sandwich that was thrown in the bin by Silvers Rayleigh, but even the former first mate of the Pirate King admitted that he would be unlikely to win against Blackbeard if it came down to a full-on fight. I would argue that the most reasonable thing for Boa Hancock to do would be to leave Amazon Lily, because neither Blackbeard nor the Marines were there for the island or its people or its snakes or its mushrooms. The Marines were there for a singular person, and Blackbeard was there for some of that sweet, sweet magical fruit. Blackbeard led an invasion purely to take Hancock's Merimeri no Mi, so if she were to leave the island, then no faction would have any reason to target Amazon Lily. However, not being on the island leaves her quite vulnerable, and look, I could see Boa Hancock joining Crossguild for very much the same sort of reason that Mihawk did. The idea of, look, I don't want to be here, but at least I'm gonna be left alone in relative peace while I am. I think it may also be the funniest possible outcome, which you should always take into consideration with Oda. I mean, the fact that Buggy is an Emperor of the Sea right now is only because it was the funniest possible thing to do. And Boa Hancock joining Crossguild would create a lot of comic tension, because she is, of course, an overt Luffy supporter, but also a self-professed Luffy lover, meaning that she may even try to actively undermine Buggy's ambitions to become the Pirate King. But I'm going to ask Hancock the same question as the rest of the warlords. If not Crossguild, then where? She can't just stay with Rayleigh because he's essentially said that he's not strong enough to protect her. And I don't know if she'd flee to Luffy because I can't see Hancock becoming a temporary crew member, nor do I really see her joining the Straw Hat Grand Fleet, mostly because all of those pirates are scattered throughout the New World at the moment. And the more I think about it, the more that Crossguild does seem like one of the more reasonable options. Because Boa Hancock does have something in common with the founding members, which is that she has been thoroughly screwed over by the world government. Something that every warlord can bond over, and there could be a collective desire among them to channel that fury right back at the world government. However, there is one original former warlord who the word fury rarely applies to, and in fact these days the entire concept of emotions in general are a bit up in the air, but because he's still with us, we should also talk about Bartholomew Kuma. He's probably the hardest former warlord to make an argument for at the moment. One, because we don't even know if he's still alive. We have his body with us, nay, his corpse, nay, his machine parts, and there are times when Oda has artfully drawn them as if he's making a slight smile. But the best case I could make for Kuma joining Crossguild is purely thematic, mainly in that it would be amazing to see all of the original former warlords of the sea minus Shinbei together again, and perhaps in the final war, what we can do right is we can recreate that iconic Marineford panel of the warlords lined up ready to fight, except this time they're gearing up to fight against the world government. And I guess the way to get Kuma there would be to say that it's too dangerous for both he and Bonnie to continue with the Straw Hats post-Elbaf. But if that were the case, then surely the most logical next point of call would be the Revolutionary Army, who have that strong emotional connection to Kuma, and who would protect his daughter with their lives, as opposed to an assortment of flippant clown pieces who would probably sell Bonnie for a chest full of shiny things. I want it to happen. I would love Kuma to face off against the world government alongside his former colleagues, but I don't know if there's a clean way to do it. Which covers the original 7 warlords. However, there have been many 7 warlords, far more than just 7, both before and after the first 7 we knew, and one currently displaced new warlord warlord is Edward Weevil. He's another Mihawk-like faction. Weevil doesn't really have a crew, he's a one-man tank, and he has a small loud woman next to him at all times. But that small loud woman could very well be the key here, because at the time of recording this video, Edward Weevil has currently been defeated by Admiral Ryokugyu and is in the delicious-sounding custody of the world government. So in order to get him back, the original, much smaller and prunier Buckingham Stussy has been looking for some friends to help her, which is why she's currently pleading with Marco on Sphinx Island. She also mentioned asking Dr. Vegapunk about Weevil's origins, implying that he's a clone of Whitebeard, but that's a bit of a difficult task to accomplish now, since most of Vegapunk is dead, and in her desperation, Miss Buckingham Stussy may turn to the one faction who has declared open hostilities against the world government with their bounty system, and promise them that both she and Weevil will join Cross Guild after a successful prison break. Now, speaking of prison, I made a comment about stripping earlier, and that's because the world government have quite literally stripped a surprising proportion of the warlords. With Crocodile, Jinbei, Doflamingo, and Weevil having now been imprisoned, which involves what I like to call the strip and dip, when new prisoners are baptized in Hell's hot tub, and Boa Hancock was stripped to be branded with the hoof of the world nobles. So a lot of them do have that very unfortunate experience in common. But back to Weevil, he's not the kind of strength that Cross Guild can just ignore. And in fact, its 3 founding members have a profound respect for Whitebeard. Just seeing Whitebeard's tattoo on Ace's back was enough to make Buggy soil his circus tent. Mihawk mentioned the distance between the two of them during the Paramount War, and Crocodile of course got his facial scar from Whitebeard back in the day. So I do think that both Buggy and Crocodile at least would not refuse that power. And the great thing about Weevil is that, look, let's be real, he's not the crunchiest biscuit in the packet. His mind is a lot softer and a bit more undercooked, meaning that he should be easy enough to issue orders to and not have to worry about him plotting against you. However, just like Kuma, there is another natural option to be considered, which is of course the formation of Neomounts. Miss Buckingham Stussy could go back to her former colleagues Judge and Caesar and plot Weevil's freedom with them, assuming that they in any way care, which is it's a big assumption. But I would be remiss not to mention the man whose name is in the word warlord, provided you spell it incorrectly, being Mr. Trafalgar Law. So Law, he's in a weird spot right now. He's effectively out of the race to become the next Pirate King, and he's no doubt gonna need to align himself with someone. And my argument for Law is quite similar to the argument with Kuma, mostly that because Law was a warlord once, it would be nice to see as many of them as we can gather together in a single crew. But I do also think that Law is quite a special case and may not need to join the support group. And whether he does or not, I will say it's my personal dream to see a brief fight between Law and Buggy, because I just want to see that moment where Law realizes that his room-cutting powers are completely countered by Buggy. But if he did join, mate, that would be a pretty big win for Cross Guild. Probably the most prestigious possible player draft to date, as acquiring Law would be acquiring another 3 billion berry bounty to add to the pile of what Buggy and Mihawk bring to the table. But I do think that Law's more natural alliance would be with Eustace Kid and potentially the other members of the Worst Generation, because the Law is a socially awkward butterfly that can be swapped between various groups in one piece, including the Warlords. But the Worst Generation, that still very much feels like his home. And look, if Doflamingo were to join Cross Guild, then I don't think it's a compatible home for Law in any way. It's very hard to imagine those two putting their grudges against one another aside for the sake of crowning a clown. But there is another warlord that we haven't discussed yet, and this is actually one who we haven't even met yet. His name is Hanafuda, and he was defeated by Ace before Luffy set out to sea. His epithet is the King of Lizards, and he's theorized to have been a plant working on behalf of Kaido and the Beast Pirates, primarily because his name fits their card game scheme, and his goal was to collect ancient Zoan fruits. And Oda went to the effort to draw this guy in the SBS of volume 109, which is much more than I ever thought we'd get of him. And I'm not saying that he'll join Cross Guild and be a big deal. No one's gonna go, oh mate, it's Hanafuda. But here's my vision, right? It's the final war. Things are very dramatic. Explosions, fire. We're about to lose everything, and then bam! Buggy the Clown arrives at the battlefield with a crew of almost every former warlord, and deep into the background is a scribbled drawing of Hanafuda. We don't make a big deal out of him, and if you don't know who you're looking for, you don't even notice him. But it would just be a nice nod to the idea of the warlords to have him there in the tiniest of capacities. And while we're here, I've also got to bring up my man Simon, the primary antagonist of One Piece, great hidden treasure of the 7 Phantom Islands for the Game Boy Advance, because he was mentioned as being on the waiting list for the 7 warlords, but never got the call to take up the position, likely because of what a disappointment he was, is, and will continue to be. But in my dream scenario where we get that glorious 2-page spread of Cross Guild during the final war, right behind the small cameo of Hanafuda, if I could ask for one more thing, and maybe just sneak a tiny Simon scribble in there there as well. Yeah, it'll be fun. This 20-year-old theory predicted the end of One Piece as well as the full path to get there, and mate, this is wild. This, what we have found right here, is an invaluable ancient relic, one that was brought to my attention by Willie Nordwrench, who also makes videos on the internet, and his video on this will be linked in the description. But this theory itself comes from the One Piece online equivalent of the Ancient Kingdom, the Arlong Park forums, and it was posted by a user named Westbound, and it was posted in a thread very boldly titled Untitled. So here's something important to note about this piece of literature. This was written on March 4th, 2005, which comes from an era before the word theory even existed. I mean, the word existed, but it didn't apply to the One Piece fanbase or anime in general. And it's only in retrospect that we can recognize this sheer dump of ideas as a theory. One of the oldest known theories in the entire English fandom. So was Westbound a Nostradamus, or was he a nerd? Stop talking now, Adamus. At the time this theory was written, the latest chapter to be released was chapter 356, which was called Tom's Son. It's near the end of the Frankie flashback. So Robin and Usopp have left the crew, and we are currently in our darkest moment of One Piece to date. But at this stage in the series, one man was able to see the full vision forward. And so let us begin the story of One Piece, the Westbound edition. First, let me say that I think One Piece is going to end sooner than later, and that the story is nearing its final stages. It will probably end within the next couple of years. So it is at this point that I would like to immediately remind you that this was written in 2005. It is now 2024, and we are still saying that exact same thing today. Yeah, One Piece, it's in its final stages, and the story is probably going to end in the next couple of years. So we haven't started the theory proper yet, but that is a massive L for Westbound. But to be fair, One Piece had been running for almost 8 years at this point, and at the time it was unprecedented for manga and Weekly Shonen Jump to be running for this long with no end in sight. For example, classic hits of the era before One Piece included Rurouni Kenshin, which ran for 5 years, Slam Dunk, which lasted 6 years, and even the mighty Dragon Ball only lasted 9 years. So this was well before the colossal age of manga. I mean, stuff like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure did exist, but that's more like 9 separate series. And at the time, Naruto and Bleach each had less than 20 volumes to their name. So all eyes are on One Piece, and the generally agreed upon thought was, this is gonna wrap up soon, right? And with that in mind, a lot of what's about to be said makes a ton more sense. So from here, Westbound goes on to predict the final 5 arcs in the series in a shocking amount of detail, starting with wrapping up our current Water 7 arc. And here, 3 major predictions were made. The Straw Hats will get a new ship for the journey ahead, plus new crew member. Robin will leave, and the Straw Hats will follow her leading into the next arc. Straw Hats' bounty will increase big time, and they will become hunted even more. So mate, that is pretty damn amazing, because our boy is 3 for 3 here. Even if 2 of those technically happened in a return to Water 7, but I'm going to give him the credit nonetheless. Flawless Water 7 predictions, good sir. But now we're going to deviate a little bit, because the next arc in the Westbound edition of One Piece is titled Robin's Past arc, where the crew will retrieve Robin and learn about her past. Her past will fully explain the Ohara incident, and we will get more info on the ancient weapon stuff, like why and how they exist and what they were used for. So I guess this is our first, little stumble. Again, a lot of this makes sense with the assumption that One Piece would be ending by 2008, but it's 2024 and we still don't actually know why the ancient weapons exist. But at the very least, we do know what one was used for. We will learn what relationship she, being Robin, has to the world government. We will also learn the government's That's actually how it's spelled. We will also learn the government's true faces and motives, brackets, namely the 5 Elder Star guys. I love that he used the word namely, because it took us all the way up to Egghead Island to even learn the names of these 5 old men. And I swear that One Piece is the only series in all of existence that can trend on Twitter by revealing the name of a single old man. That's all he had to do. There was no lore bomb, there was no big action. Oda just put a name tag on an old man, and mate, we went wild that week. We will learn info on Aokiji and the past incident between him and Robin. Another big fight will break out, Straw Hats versus the Marines. Maybe Aokiji again, or maybe Smoker will make his return. A big revelation about Roger will be made, only adding fuel to the fire of his mystery. Straw Hats will win, and their bounties will get increased big time. With Robin back and all the new info learned, the the Straw Hats will set off to the new arc. Alright, so this man had some pretty big expectations of Enies Lobby, nay, Robin's past arc. Highly regarded as one of the best arcs in all of the series, but compared to the Westbound edition, mate, Enies Lobby fell flat. What I love most about this is that Westbound expected the Straw Hat bounties would be raised again after already having them increased at the end of Water 7 for some reason. Roger stuff aside, these predictions, they're not terrible, especially the big fight with the Marines. And I also think it was pretty reasonable to assume that Aokiji may have had a bigger role to play here, considering that he kicked this entire saga off. And look, to provide some context, I was a forum dweller during Enies Lobby, and there were a lot of expectations about the Marines at the time. When the Buster Call was initiated, every named Marine in the series was speculated to turn up. Smoker, Toshiki, Hina, Django Fullbody, John Giant, Kobe Helmepopo, and even Garp before we knew he was Luffy's grandfather. For a brief period, the popular thought was that this was going to be what Marineford would go on to be. And the same thing still happens to this very day. When the raid on Onigashima was happening, everyone weekly was just talking about who wasn't there and anticipating who else was going to show up. Internet denizens were convinced that Dragon and the Revolutionary Army were going to join the raid, that the Grand Fleet were going to arrive, that the rest of the Whitebeard pirates were going to rock up, and that the Marines were going to launch a full-on assault led by Kizaru, and also that Blackbeard was going to crash the party at the last second. None of that went on to happen, so I do find it pretty funny that absolutely nothing has changed in this fan base in 20 years. But this is where things get real interesting. We're done with the Robin's Past arc now, we're moving on. And the next arc in the Westbound edition is titled The Pirate Summit Arc. Now, for anyone who's been involved in this fan base for approximately 2 decades or around there, you'll know exactly what this is referring to. And for anyone who hasn't, you won't, and for good reason, because it doesn't exist. Back when this theory was written, the English translation of One Piece hadn't even finished Syrup Village, meaning that if you actually wanted to read One Piece, you had to do so via some very sketchy fan translations on MSN groups. And these translations were known for some pretty ridiculous mistakes. The most famous one that you may or may not know was during Jaya, where Doflamingo was introduced as Tanjado Lofulamingo, and Bartholomew Kuma was named Bisoromi Bear. And they were both labeled as members of the 7 gods of pirate singular, not plural. So that's the kind of quality that we were dealing with. And you know what? We were grateful to have that much, but it did quite radically alter our perception of what was actually happening in One Piece. And one such event was during the Alabasta arc when the Straw Hats met Ace. And just before Ace departed, his final words to Luffy are, "Next time we meet will be on the high seas." That's what it is now in the actual English. However, back in the day, this was mistranslated as, "The next time we meet will be at the Pirate Summit." And mate, for literal years, this one line completely skewed the direction of One Piece for English readers, because it made it sound like the Pirate Summit was an actual event that we were preparing for. Some sort of annual battle royale between all of the world's greatest pirates to decide who would go to the Raftail, or Raftel at the time, to claim the One Piece. Hence why Westbound has included the Pirate Summit arc, because at the time it was one of the very few future events that we knew for sure had to happen. And I can't believe I'm old enough to remember this stuff. This is like digging up the ruins of ancient Rome, except you've got Caesar behind you to explain what all of the crap was for. But exactly what was going to happen in this Pirate Summit arc, you ask? Anticipatorily, the Straw Hats and the Whitebeard pirates will run into each other. Luffy and Whitebeard will fight. Luffy will get beat, but will earn Whitebeard's respect. Another big revelation about Roger will be revealed. Brackets, maybe a big hint on his relationship with Luffy? The major part of this arc will be Luffy versus Don Flamingo. It will be the theme of old school pirates versus new age pirates. Luffy will win, thus revealing Don Flamingo's ideals are full of shit. The Straw Hats bounty will get increased by a huge amount. With whatever happens, the Straw Hats will get hints on where to go for their next location. Shanks and Whitebeard will meet, and in the process, something big concerning the story will be revealed. Brackets, info about the One Piece. And finally, everything will mold together, and it will lead on to the next arc. So there's a lot happening there, as it should, because mate, this is the Pirate Summit arc. And before we point out the misses, I would actually like to give some credit here for the prediction of Whitebeard and Shanks meeting. Although that was set up in Jaya, so you could have seen it coming, still, it's good reading comprehension, good job. I don't mean that sarcastically, I said it very sarcastically, like actually good job. But essentially, what was supposed to happen in the Westbound edition was, after Enies Lobby, Luffy was going to fight both Doflamingo and Whitebeard. He was going to beat Doflamingo, but lose to Whitebeard. However, However, Luffy would earn Whitebeard's respect, and I'm going to give him partial credit for that. Luffy did earn Whitebeard's respect during Marineford, and he did beat Doflamingo eventually. It just took about 10 years longer than Westbound predicted. And this, of course, brings us to the penultimate arc in the Westbound canon, which is, of course, the Raftel arc. Remembering that at the time, we were 14 years away from the revelation that the island was actually called Laugh-Tale. They will arrive in Raftel along with other pirates, and some big things will happen. Man, 2005, it was a very different time. You cannot get away with theory crafting like this anymore. Imagine if my predictions for Elbaf were just the crew are gonna get to the island and then some important stuff's gonna happen. However, the Westbound edition now has a massive twist. Ace will defeat Blackbeard, and some ironic twist will be revealed. Maybe Blackbeard is Ace's father? And I think this prediction is phenomenal because it's the exact opposite of what actually happened. It's like Westbound, he was driving on the right road but in the wrong direction. Because Ace, of course, ended up losing to Blackbeard. However, Ace's father was a huge twist when it was revealed that it was Roger. And I think this is even more worthy of credit because at the time, Ace and Luffy were thought to be related by blood. So predicting that Ace would have a different father is certainly a sliver of observation Haki demonstrated. But as for the rest of the Raftel arc, we will learn the full story on Gold Roger and his past. Robin will learn the true history. Zoro will fight and defeat Mihawk and become the greatest swordsman in the world. The 5 Elder Stars will show up and fight the Straw Hats. The Straw Hats will win and eliminate the threat the government poses to them. After defeating the 5 Elder Stars and learning Roger's past, they will find the exact location of the One Piece. Dragon will reappear in some fashion, and this will lead to the last arc. So a lot of this is very hard to judge because Westbound is now looking far beyond where we actually are in 2024. But I do think he's pretty spot on with Dragon at the very least, because we are now threatening to start the Laugh-Tale arc without him having done a single thing of substance since Logtown. And what I'm most interested by is the logic of having an arc take place on Laugh-Tale, but not claiming the One Piece itself or mentioning Luffy becoming the Pirate King. But look, let's not doubt Westbound too quickly. This is an intentional twist because the Westbound edition has bigger plans. It's heavily implied that the One Piece is not on Laugh-Tale and is in fact in the location of the final arc. And instead, we are going to find it during the One Piece arc, which will take place in the middle of All Blue, thus fulfilling Sanji's dream. 4 groups will fight over the One Piece: Whitebeard Pirates, Straw Hats, Red Hair Pirates, Dragon. And so you got to give him some credit here as well for establishing that 4 groups were going to be integral. Because remember, this theory was written well before the 4 emperors were revealed. We had no idea they existed. Hence why there's no mention of Big Mom and Kaido anywhere in the Westbound edition. But this prediction isn't too dissimilar from what's actually happening with the current 4 emperors. Luffy, Shanks, Buggy, and Blackbeard are all set up for a potential 4-way clash for the One Piece. So I don't know, good on him for just pulling that number 4 out of his ass and having it be relevant. But what happens next is absolutely brutal for Luffy and the Straw Hats. The first, I think he means first fight, will be the Straw Hats versus Whitebeard. After Luffy beats Whitebeard, Whitebeard will reveal Roger's relationship to Luffy. He doesn't say what that relationship is, but it will be revealed. Straw Hats will find the One Piece and will be confronted by Shanks' group. A big fight will ensue between the 2 groups, and the Straw Hats will emerge victorious. So again, this is brutal. First, what Luffy needs to do is he needs to bring down the strongest man in the world. Then immediately after, he needs to beat Shanks, and then it gets worse. Luffy will become the Pirate King, and then Dragon will reappear. The final fight of the series will be Dragon versus Luffy, and Dragon will be the super evil one who wants to destroy the government and enslave the world with the ancient weapons. But somehow Luffy will win and save the world and make Roger proud or something. What I really like about this is that Westbound has actually kind of created his own Rocksteady Zebek, because in his canon, Dragon sounds pretty much exactly like Rocks. And I guess this officially makes Dragon the final villain of the Westbound edition of One Piece. But a couple of things to note. Westbound elects not to predict what the One Piece itself is, which I think is probably a wise decision. He also never mentions what happens between Luffy and Shanks in regards to returning the Straw Hat. He does predict that Shanks will be a less than friendly faction in the final arc, and that's looking pretty on point. I mean, I don't think we're going full on evil Shanks, but Shanks is going for the One Piece and is currently one of Luffy's key rivals. Westbound also never mentions the other Marine Admirals, despite the fact that we know they've existed since Long Ring Longland, or what happens to Ace after he defeats his father Blackbeard. But luckily for us, we also have a Westbound epilogue. All of the past people in the series will learn that Luffy became the Pirate King. They will travel back through the Grand Line and meet Laboon again and various faces. The Straw Hats will all return to their homes to tell their adventures. The series will end with the crew reuniting a few years later and sailing off into the ocean carefree like old times. The end. And then there's some post-author commentary. Of course, there will be plenty more plot twists and various other things that I didn't mention, but anyways, that's how I think it will end. So the series isn't too far off from ending. I give it another 5 years before One Piece ends. Alright, so let's do some quick maths on that. Westbound predicted that One Piece would end around March 2010. And that would take us to chapter 576, which is the chapter where Whitebeard dies during the Paramount War, and then later that year, we would go through the time skip and officially begin the second half of One Piece, which has now lasted significantly longer than the first half. And you know, honestly, I really don't think the predictions were too bad for 2005. There are some pretty glaring things missing, but I can't even blame reading comprehension for that because what we were reading back then was barely English. It was a completely different One Piece. And look, there is still time for the Westbound edition to pay dividends here, as we have yet to explore Laugh Tale and the One Piece, so there is still time for him to be correct. Luffy could land on Laugh Tale and then Whitebeard gets resurrected by Gecko Moria, then Shanks and his super evil father Dragon, not Shanks, Luffy's father. It doesn't matter because Luffy's gonna punch all three of them. He saves the world and then Roger from Beyond the Grave is proud or something. The end of peak fiction. Now I will say that the reception to this theory at the time was a little less than mind blown. In fact, the very first comment is a lot of dots and then blink. Seems like you did not read all the story yet. Sign. I wish people would stop acting like if the end is coming too fast or something. And Westbound did what you never meant to do on the internet and replied directly to this criticism, which then became one of the most infamous One Piece comments ever created. Why do you say I haven't read it all? FYI, I've read everything so far. Rolls eyes. And you wish that people wouldn't act like the end is coming so fast? Dude, did you even read what I typed? I said 5 years. 5 years is hardly fast. You gotta face it, man. One Piece won't go on forever, and it's going to end sooner rather than later. Brackets. Read the SBS comments sometimes. Oda said he doesn't want to make One Piece his life work, and he is already 30 years old or something. And One Piece started when? 1996, right? Wrong, 1997. That's almost 10 years. Lamau, One Piece won't be like Hajime no Ippo and go on to volume 100 plus. So for all of you still watching this video far, far into the future in 2024, as One Piece has just released volume 109, let this be a lesson in humility as well as the folly that is trying to predict fictional pirates. Monkey D. Luffy's powers are even more insane than we thought. Because you thought it was Sun God, but it was me, Dream God. And Luffy has been using this power since the very beginning of One Piece. However, this is not an ability that he can use alone. And Oda has been very hyper-conscious of it, going all of the way back to East Blue. The ancient being Nika is said to be the warrior of liberation, a being that descends to end the suffering of those who believe in him in the most ridiculous and most rubbisome of ways. And what we tend to focus on is the power of Nika himself. However, the true power source of the Sun God is the will and drive of those who believe in him. Without that, Nika is powerless, and the same is true of Luffy. So you know what, let me give you the most fantastic example in the universe, and ask who was the MVP of Alabasta? Was it Luffy for enduring 3 rounds against a crocodile? Was it Vivi for destroying her voice, stopping the war? Or was it Pell for delivering Luffy and getting rid of that nasty, nasty bomb? No, it was none of those. Not the monkey, not the princess, and definitely not the bird. In fact, the MVP of the entire Alabasta arc wasn't even present for the battle at Albana. The MVP that I refer to is Toto, the sole resident of what once was the Uber Oasis, and whose name in the 4Kids dub is Tutu, potentially because they didn't want to risk being sued by the band Toto, you know, the ones that sing Africa with the line about blessing the rains. You know that thing it is that the Toto in One Piece was desperately waiting for? But look, I'm gonna put this bluntly. Without Toto, Alabasta falls. It doesn't matter how much Luffy, Vivi, and and the rest of the Wacky Hat Gang tried, they would have failed. And it's because without Todo, you lose the heart and the will of the nation of Alabasta. Todo resides in Yuba, and Yuba's symbolism is the heart of Alabasta. It was an oasis built to act as a crossroad between 4 of Alabasta's major cities in the western desert. The very existence of Yuba made crossing the desert easier, and it linked all of these cities up. It led to a much more lively and prosperous Alabasta. And that is why Crocodile repeatedly targeted with his sandstorms to shut down that heart and to isolate the rest of the country. And when we visit, Yuba is all dried up. It's a town with no visible hope remaining. Yuba looks like what Alabana would have looked like the day after if Crocodile succeeded. But there is one tiny bit of hope remaining within Yuba's sole resident, Todo, who describes the situation as follows. This wasn't the first sandstorm to hit Yuba. 3 years ago, the land began to dry and the sands began to blow. The desert is at war with Yuba, and little by little, the oasis is losing ground. Quite pessimistic, but then something not that. He proudly declares that Yuba will never surrender to the sands. I'll dig for as long as it takes. And Todo has faith not only in the land, but also in the king of Alabasta. Todo possesses a complete and unshakable belief in Nefertari Cobra, which he conveys to Vivi, whereas everyone else in Yuba, they abandoned the town because they lost faith in the king. But Todo's faith held firm, and so he stayed. And with that minuscule thread of hope, Todo dug and he dug and he dug some more, searching for the water of the oasis. Todo didn't even know this, but at the time he was engaged in a 1v1 with Sir Crocodile. There's a fantastic page during Luffy versus Crocodile where we cut from Todo saying that Yuba is still alive to Crocodile claiming that Yuba will die. And this is where the true battle of Alabasta took place. And it was a brutal struggle, one that we only saw the briefest glimpse of. And in that glimpse, it took Todo all night, but all of that effort later, and what Todo managed to secure was a small mug of water that he gave to Luffy. A token so minor and so seemingly insignificant, but one that would completely change the fate of Alabasta. This small mug of water was that thread of hope, that relentless determination of the nation. And there's a great visual metaphor for the power of this water in round 1 of Luffy vs. Crocodile. When Luffy gets his arm dried out, he drinks some of the Yuba water and his arm regrows to a comically muscular size. But the true moment that Todo saved the entire country comes when Crocodile impales Luffy, and Luffy is finally able to grab that crocodile, all thanks to the water from Yuba wetting his arm. Without this simple moment, Luffy never would have defeated Crocodile, and Alabasta likely wouldn't even exist anymore, as Crocodile did claim that he would reduce the whole country to sand in an effort to find Pluton. And the seed of hope only grows from here. As we go on to manifest the will of Alabasta in the ever so powerful Water Luffy form, and in round 3, Luffy comes up with the idea to use his own monkey blood, which is eventually enough to defeat Crocodile. But it all spawned from Todo's drive not to give in to the desert. That teeny tiny mug of water made all the difference. Todo's resilience saved Alabasta every bit as much as Vivi's drive, Pel's sacrifice, or Luffy's fists. And my favorite moment of celebration after Crocodile's defeat is when we cut back to Todo alone in Yuba, smiling up at the sky as it rains, and he says, just 3 years. That's all it took. Which implies that Todo's will is stronger than I've even given it credit for in this video. The idea of just 3 years makes me believe that Todo would have kept digging for 5, 10, 20, and however many years that his life would allow him. And against a man of that kind of unbreakable determination, Crocodile never stood a chance. Because Crocodile is a man who gave up on his dream after being defeated a single time by Whitebeard. In terms of sheer willpower, Crocodile was completely outclassed by Todo, and that is how Alabasta endured. The way I like to put it is that the people of any given nation in One Piece aren't capable of actually defeating the main threat themselves, but then again, neither is Luffy. And a lot of the time in Kingdom Arc specifically, the story revolves around Luffy and the nation finding that right synergy to come together. And it's that combined willpower that allows Luffy to overcome the enemy. And simultaneously, that combined willpower that allows Luffy to manifest the dreams of the determined ones. And the same was true of Skypiea. When Robin discovers the lost city of Shandora, it has been completely stripped of all of its gold. It is completely nude, scandalous city. This city is the pride and the will of the Shandian tribe. It was what they were seeking to find and protect for the last 400 years in the sky and 400 years before that on the Blue Sea. And what this naughty NL did right was he tried to use their own gold against them by utilizing it as a core component of the Arc Maxim, as well as coating Luffy's arm in the gold to try and avoid fighting him. Robin's hypothesis was that even at the height of Shandora's prosperity, the city's primary goal goal was to protect its history. And Enel foolishly delivers this gold, aka the legacy of Shandora, right to the one person who could use it, not only to dispel his island-destroying Uranus wannabe mega weapon, but also to defeat him and ring the Funky Bell. Much like the Water of Yuba, Luffy could not have defeated Enel without the gold of Shandora. It was that will and resilience of the Shandian tribe that gave Luffy the power to take Enel down. But Skypiea, look, it's a bit more complicated than Alabasta because it has a fair few threads going. And this next one is more intangible, but it's the desire of Luffy to ring the Golden Bell, which is an act that has had a long and ever-changing meaning in history. For example, the reason why the Shandians originally rang the Golden Bell was to guide the spirits of their ancestors. However, that reason changed after Nolan's visit, as the Shandians began ringing the bell waiting for Nolan to visit them again to guide him back. And the reason to ring the bell changed once more after Luffy met Mont Blanc Cricket, as Luffy's desire was then to ring the bell to let Cricket know that the truth he'd been searching for this whole time was in the sky. I really want to emphasize that Luffy's main driving force to beat Enel on Skypiea is not to beat Enel. It's not even to save the island. It's to ring the bell and stop Enel from attaining the bell. If I ring the bell, they should be able to hear it. If I don't, they'll just keep searching the ocean floor until they die. There's no way I'm gonna let Enel take it. They should be able to hear a bell that big from anywhere, so I'm gonna ring that golden bell. Defeating Enel is arguably an incidental event that occurred whilst Luffy was trying to ring the bell. Enel got in the way, but there's more than one layer to this. During Skypiea, there's a section where we see 3 kids speaking, and one of them tells about how his father is one of God's divine squad, aka one of the people that Enel was forcing to build the Arc Maxim. It's such a random little cutaway, but what it does is humanize the divine squad, who up until this point we've mainly seen as straight up enemies. But it also sets up the final conflict between Luffy and Enel, because it's only through the Arc Maxim that we're able to reach the location of the Golden Bell. So it's not just the will of one party that's contributing here. Alabasta was quite monolithic. We were only looking at one group of people to help there, so we only needed one element, the water of the Oasis of Yuba, the heart of Alabasta, if you will, and I will. But on Skypiea, we had 3 separate groups. The descendant of Mont Blanc Noland, who gave Luffy the drive to ring the bell, the Shandian tribe, who gave Luffy the gold to ring the bell, and the citizens of Skypiea, who built the Ark capable of reaching the bell. And again, Enel's defeat is more or less incidental, as is the salvation of Skypiea, which might sound odd, but Monkey D. Luffy has always been a man who does big things for such seemingly small reasons. Luffy's main concern isn't that Enel's going to destroy the entire island. His main concern is that Enel is going after the Golden Bell, and if he gets it, then Luffy won't have the chance to ring it for Cricket down on the Blue Sea. Luffy is something of a dreamsmith. He specializes in bringing dreams to reality. However, he usually lacks the specific tools to do so, which is why it's up to the Dream Havers to provide him with those tools, whether it be water on Alabasta, gold on Skypiea, or in the case of Thriller Bark, shadows. I think Thriller Bark showcases this effect about as literally as it gets in One Piece. Charlotte Lola and her crew are members of the Thriller Bark Victims Association, a group of people who have had their shadows stolen by Gecko Moria and have banded together to survive on Thriller Bark. And as part of this, they begin to acquire stray shadows here and there. And in the One Piece world, shadows are separate living entities cast by their solid partners. And the shadows also inherit the personalities of their solids, and therefore the wills of their previous owners. So when the Victims Association insert 100 of these shadows into Luffy to create Nightmare Luffy, this is Luffy being directly fueled by the victims of Gecko Moria. He has been given the power, the skills, and the knowledge he needs to liberate the Victims Association. But in the case of Thriller Bark, the shadows did a lot more than that. Because when Moria uses his ability to absorb all 1,000 shadows for the Shadow's Asgard ability, and thus making him mathematically at least 10 times more powersome than Nightmare Luffy was, it is these shadows that actively hinder him. I don't want to undersell this. These 1,000 shadows turned Gecko Moria into one of the most physically powerful characters we've ever seen in One Piece. The dude was punching islands. However, his mind couldn't handle them all. And after losing command, the shadows rebelled against him. They started escaping, and they gave Luffy the opportunity to defeat Moria right as the sun rose. And a huge part of this was Lola, who was pleading to her shadow to return. A message that was heard and felt not only by her shadow, but by every shadow. And it was all 1,000 victims of Gecko Moria that banded together, rebelled against his control, and allowed Luffy to bring him down. If it was just straight up Luffy versus Moria, this might be controversial, but I think that Luffy would have lost. He had his shadow stolen, and all Moria had to do was last until sunrise, which he very nearly almost did. However, he didn't, because the shadow save the day. The association reminds me a lot of Toto actually, because he spent 3 years struggling in the Oasis, whereas the Victims Association spent 3 years trapped in the darkness of a zombie apocalypse. And the Victims Association never gave up hope. They endured the long night, and their will was eventually rewarded by finally allowing them to see their next sunrise. In this case, it's also very tempting to blame Moray himself, his arrogance to think that he could handle that many shadows, but that's really no different from what Crocodile and Enel were doing. All three of these villains were trying to overexert their will on a group of victims, and all three failed, because the collective will of said victims overpowered them. And I should say that this also applies to more Straw Hat focused sagas as well. During Enies Lobby, Luffy versus Rob Lucci isn't just a 1v1. There are 3 Straw Hats aside from Luffy who are integral to his victory, and Luffy would not have been able to defeat Lucci without. The first was Frankie, the Enies Lobby key bearer. Frankie briefly engages Rob Lucci in a 2v1 alongside Luffy. However, what Frankie gives Luffy is the reassurance that Robin will be free, which allows Luffy to put his full focus on that leopard. Meanwhile, the second crew member was Usopp, who despite having left the Straw Hats, gave Luffy the words he needed to stand up that one last time against Lucci. And finally, of course, we have Nico Robin, who was Luffy's core driving force and gave him what he needed to not fall that one last time before delivering the final blow to Lucci. This instance is definitely a bit more standard shonen, but that's because even though Water 7 is one of the longest stretches of individual stories in One Piece, it's also one of the simplest and about an intercrew conflict. And it's no accident that the 3 emotional centers of this arc, Robin, Usopp, and Frankie, are the ones that contribute to Luffy's victory over Lucci, because this arc was about examining their dreams and desires. So it fell to the 3 of them to give Luffy the tools he needed to make those a reality. And I also want to go over one small but powerful example of this. Back in Arlong Park, originally Nami always cried when seeing Genzo due to his probably scary face. However, Genzo figured out that if he wore a pinwheel on his head, then it would make Nami happy, which is the biggest giveaway that he knew about Nami's deal with Arlong the entire time, because he kept wearing that pinwheel, doing what he could to bring her as much happiness as possible. And this pinwheel becomes another integral tool for Luffy to use. Luffy sees Genzo wearing this pinwheel, completely unaware of what it means to him and by extension what it means to Nami, and Luffy uses that as inspiration to create Gomu Gomu no Pinwheel, a move that he uses in the fight against the Arlong Pirates to free Nami and grant the happiness that the pinwheel itself is meant to represent. And of course, the beautiful full stop to this story is that Nami gets that pinwheel tattooed on her arm in the place of the Arlong crew tattoo. But the pinwheel, to me, it's like Toto digging for the water, like Shandians protecting Shandora, like the Victims Association struggling in the dark. It is a symbol of endurance, one that remained even after Kokoyashi experienced almost a full decade of Arlong's rule. And these symbols are incredibly important because, as stated by Luffy himself, he will not risk his life out of pity. He will only help those who already have the will and drive to help themselves. And it's only through that combination that all of the magic happens. And this is one of the reasons why I'm not a huge fan of trying to seriously power scale in One Piece, especially when it comes to Luffy, because usually it's not a straight up 1v1 affair. And if it is, a lot of the time, Luffy's actually gonna lose. There are so many opponents that Luffy could lose to and would have been defeated by if not for the direct assistance of those he was fighting on behalf of. Luffy never fights alone. And it's not that Luffy is completely useless without the help of others. It's just that the entire concept of even fighting in the first place becomes meaningless without that collaboration. Luffy is the manifestation of desires, hopes, and dreams of those around him. That is the legend of the sun god Nika. And if you give him the tools, then mate, he will build you a dream. Water to propagate Alabasta, gold to preserve the history of Shandora, and even a pinwheel to kick a shark in the dick. Whatever your dream is, he will make it a reality, but only if you're prepared to give everything to make it happen as well. This is the greatest Frankie theory ever, allegedly. That's the title of a video by Civ Retcon on the YouTube, and honestly, I kinda agree. This is definitely one of the best Frankie ideas that I've ever heard, which involves combining the inherited will of Tom with the skills and technology of Dr. Vegapunk to play an absolutely integral role in the future dawn of the world. And the only man thing who can make all of this happen is Frankie. So there'll be a link to the original video in the description, but this is my take on the greatest Frankie theory ever. Firstly, as much as Egghead Island chose not to dwell on this or really reference it at all, Frankie has a deep connection to Dr. Vegapunk. And throughout the series, Frankie has been carrying out Vegapunk's inherited will in much the same way that he's been carrying out Tom's. When it really, truly, honestly comes down to it, Frankie is more of a scientist than he is a shipwright. He's a scientist who applies his skills to shipbuilding. And he even calls himself that, which we'll see in a bit. But this is something that Oda has very much had in mind all of the time. In fact, one of my favorite things that Oda has ever done is draw the good and bad timeline future Straw Hats, because the good timeline versions reveal what's truly important to each of these characters. And in Frankie's case, at age 50, he's on a winter island and he's offering to add a heating system to said island, which was Vegapunk's idea and an ambition that he could not complete, at least not on his homeland. During the time skip, Frankie was sent to the birthplace of Dr. Vegapunk, Karakuri Island, not to be confused with the non-canon Karakuri Island, which was the setting of One Piece Movie 7, and to increase the potential confusion, it also goes by a second name being the future country Baltimore. However, this is an island that we'd already seen long before in NL's cover story. This was the home of Dr. Tsukimi, who made Lieutenant Spacey and his comrades Cosmo, Galaxy, and Macro. However, I only point this out because it's slightly inconsistent, as Karakuri here is clearly not a winter island. We see quite a bit of it, and there is not a flake of snow to be found. So here is an idea. We don't actually know when the Spacey flashbacks take place in this cover story. All we know is that NL finds Spacey and they stumble upon what is described as a quote, old battlefield, which we discover on the cover of chapter 437, Naked Mania, which is the chapter where Robin grabs at Frankie's balls. So the Spacey flashback could have taken place before Vegapunk was even born. Perhaps during a time when Karakuri Island was normal and very not winter-y, and then, oh no, some phenomena happened to transform it into a winter island. And that's why Vegapunk was so determined to build a heating system, because this wasn't a natural winter island and its residents were suffering under brutal climate change. Although I should say it's infinitely more likely that this is just a little artistic inconsistency, because Spacey then remembers fighting against the space pirates, so it must have happened pretty much at the same time, but it was a cool idea for about a second. In any case, Frankie is sent to Karakuri Island during the 2-year time skip, and he encountered a weird mountain that, as it turns out, Vegapunk built as a child. It was intended to be a geothermal heating system for the entire island, however, it was never finished. There were 2 big problems that prevented its completion. One was that Vegapunk's ideas were impossible to implement with modern day technology. Well, modern day back then, past technology? Although modern day still now couldn't do things. It couldn't be done with the stuff we had. And the second is that Vegapunk lacked the funding to develop this technology himself. However, this is something that Vegapunk would go on to sort of implement on Egghead Island. It had a system known as the Island AC, which could control the climate of the entire island, which transformed Egghead from a winter island to a tropical climate. The kind of island that Karakuri actually was initially in NL's cover story before becoming a winter island somehow. For whatever reason, Dr. Vegapunk never saw fit to grace his homeland with this technology. Karakuri is still a blizzardy hell, but it's probably because the world government wouldn't have paid for it even if he tried. However, Frankie was empathetic with the residents of Karakuri Island to the point of tears. And when Frankie empathizes with someone's cause, he does everything he can to champion it, like Robin at Enies Lobby or the Tontada tribe on Dressrosa. And very interestingly, during his time on Karakuri Island, this is where Frankie referred to himself as a scientist. While Frankie was in Vegapunk's lab, he said, "As a scientist, I don't want to wreck any of his stuff." He said this immediately before he pressed the self-destruct button, mistaking it for a pirate symbol in a very comical callback to Chopper's tragic mushroom situation. But Oda is essentially saying that Frankie's future, at least partially, carries on Vegapunk's inherited will. The way he's speaking at age 50 implies that he's on a new island, not Karakuri, and that he finds it too cold, so he offers to install heating for the residents. Which to me would imply that he's already gone and done the same thing for Karakuri Island, because again, he was very empathetic to their situation. He has not forgotten. And then at age 70, Frankie even adopts the Egghead Hawaiian shirt aesthetic, or more accurately, Egghead Island borrowed the Hawaiian shirt aesthetic from Frankie, because this future was published a year before the Straw Hats even set foot on the island, and of course Frankie has always been a proud supporter of flashy palm trees on clothing. There's a lot of very natural integration between Frankie and Vegapunk. Frankie takes Vegapunk's technology, Vegapunk takes Frankie's fashion. And honestly, they're a much more natural pair than, say, Frankie and Tom. And whether you enjoy this idea or not, I do think it would make a lot of sense if Frankie was the son of Queen, which is an idea so outrageous but ever so potentially true that you should absolutely check out the full video I did on it. But it would be quite fitting for Queen's child to inherit the will of someone so ideologically opposed to him. Much like Sanji, also a child of a Mads member, who inherited the will of a cook, something that Vince Smoke Judge adamantly insisted that Sanji could would never lower himself to being. Franky also has a very particular set of skills that he's acquired over a very long career. Skills which make him a dream for the future of mankind. In chapter 1062, Atlas gets very angry about the food replicators, stating that they didn't have enough technicians to mass produce them. She goes on to state that it's the same for the island AC function and of pretty much everything on the island. It's not just a funding issue. You can have all of the money in the world, but we also have a skill shortage. It is a labor issue. Right now, or at least back then when we still had control of everything, the Vegapunks possess the materials to mass produce at least the food replicators. And so there's a very envious potential in the One Piece world to nigh on eradicate world hunger. But there aren't enough people with a skill level high enough to actually build them. And to that I say, enter Franky, who has modeled all of his post-time skip abilities on Vegapunk's plans, and has proved himself to be more than skilled enough to follow these plans to perfection. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves here. We really shouldn't assign someone else's will to Franky without first examining his own dream. Franky's dream is to, of course, build a ship that can circumnavigate the globe, which in theory he's already done. It's one of those time delay dreams that we're eagerly waiting to tick off when all the conditions are met, with the only issue being that the Thousand Sunny actually needs to do the thing, and that's why Franky is accompanying it, to be able to maintain it and celebrate it the day it becomes the Ship of Dreams. Franky refers to the Thousand Sunny as the Ship of Dreams. However, Franky is a bit of a unique case dream-wise, because he's also said that Luffy is the only person capable of turning the Thousand Sunny into a Ship of Dreams. Franky said this whilst wearing a tiger skin which he accidentally set on fire, and then ran through the island to put out, thus creating an incident that would be remembered as the legend of Baldamore's burning beast. Incident aside, Franky has given up a huge locus of control here. At the moment, Franky's dream is more reliant on Luffy. He's entrusted Luffy with his dream, as the only man who can captain this vessel and turn it into the Ship of Dreams. However, to some degree, I think that's true of the rest of the crew as well. Nami is the only person who can navigate to Franky's dream, Jinbei is the only person who can steer it, and Zoro is the only person who can be asleep the entire time, and I guess make Sunny a literal Ship of Dreams. It's much more of a group effort than most Straw Hat dreams, which means that Franky has a bit more open space in his dream inventory than the rest of the crew do. And Franky may very well choose to follow in the path of Tom, who built the Oro Jackson, vessel of Goldie Roger, Pirate King Extraordinaire, and the first known person to successfully sail around the world. And doing so was a source of great pride for Tom, but that wasn't the end of his ambition or his purpose. In a very similar maneuver, Tom entrusted that ship to Roger, just like how Franky is entrusting his dream to Luffy. Franky's just a bit more hands-on about it than Tom was, and Tom also had a much greater dream behind that, with the final act of his life being to connect Water 7 to the outside world. You see, thanks to all of this flooding caused by those nasty ancient weapons, Water 7 is much more isolated and in much more danger than most of the world. And the island was on the verge of anarchy because it had no way of sustaining itself. And so Tom invented the concept of a sea train that would allow fast and safe travel to other islands, which revolutionized Water 7's economy and has now allowed it to become one of the more pleasant islands to live on in the Grand Line, all because of its connection to other islands. And so Water 7 is a small-scale example of what we're trying to do with the One Piece world as a whole. We are trying to reconnect everyone, and then something eternal happiness maybe. But during the 2-year time skip, Iceberg followed in the tracks of Tom as well, and not only developed the idea to turn all of Water 7 into a ship in order to ensure its safety and prosperity, but he also built another sea train to further connect Water 7 known as the Puffing Ice, which is the spiritual successor to the original Puffing Tom. And just another fun fact about the Puffing Ice that I don't think will ever find its way into another video. In One Piece Stampede, the Puffing Ice makes an appearance crossing Delta Island, and it's carrying a bunch of filler and movie characters as its passengers. For example, in one window you can see Zhao, the little girl from Strongworld, with Arpiece from the Warship Island arc. But look, if we keep this trend going with the Puffing Tom and the Puffing Ice, then I think it would be really cool to see a Puffing Franky in the future. Except this could be a much larger scale project. Inspired by Tom and empowered by Vegapunk, Franky could aim to connect the entire world via clouds and a sky train or even a series of sky ships that can go back and forth. Because the sea trains are great, but they have their obvious limitations. In the sea, you can't even go into the sea, they can only be on top of it. And building a sky train, it might seem like a bit of a jump, but the Straw Hats have already demonstrated the seed of this idea. When the crew arrived at Punk Hazard, a group of them then took the Mini Mary onto the island thanks to a milky road created by Nami, which she learned from Witheria. And just look at the two reactions that Oda decides to show to this ability. One is Luffy and the other is Franky, who is absolutely absolutely gobsmacked. This moment here could be the inception of an idea. We see two locations bridged by clouds, and wouldn't it be great if the whole world could be connected like that? I also think it's a natural evolution of the idea of the Thousand Sunny as well, which can already temporarily fly after guzzling some delicious cola. But when I think about a ship named the Thousand Sunny carrying the sun god to enact the dawn of the world, it becomes clear that this vessel simply belongs in the sky. Now, Nami's Milky Road can unfortunately only create temporary clouds. However, Vegapunk figured out how to create permaclouds, and also a whole series of vehicles that operate via cloud technology. Clouds are this stupidly important and probably his biggest and most versatile technological breakthrough. And Vegapunk would agree with this assessment. The most important technology developed on Egghead Island wasn't necessarily Punk Records, the Mother Flame, or the Seraphim, because the one that was identified as of paramount importance was the cloud producing plant, as Vegapunk says. There is one other thing we cannot afford to lose: the cloud plant that produces island clouds. Those clouds might be the foundation of humanity's survival after all, which is a very unfortunate thing to say because they did in fact lose it. The cloud plant wasn't part of the lava phase that majestically shot up into the air with Punk Records. However, Stella, Shaka, and Pythagoras must have definitely planned for this to be the case. York and the world government currently have control of the original cloud plant. However, a background issue that never got addressed during Egghead Island was the matter of Vegapunk's luggage. During Kizaru's invasion, Jinbei and Sanji were taking care of the, and I quote, so-called luggage to bring with them to leave. And given how they refer to it as so-called luggage, I imagine that Jinbei and Sanji are less than impressed with all of the weird tech it is they had to carry. But what would be worth risking the time to retrieve in the midst of fighting against a Marine Admiral and a Busticle? My guess would be probably stuff that allows you to create another cloud plant, which Vegapunk believes could be the foundation of humanity's survival. And as Civ rather perfectly pointed out in his video, this is just screaming to be built by Franky because the original cloud plant was already shaped like a cola bottle. That is not just inherited will, that is destiny. And even though we do still have Lilith, she surely cannot handle everything alone, and will be in need of a skilled technician, the ones that Atlas was complaining that not enough of exist, but we do have one and he is very super. Although it's very important to note that Franky is not the only person in the world that we can look to for help, because other people I could see being able to handle this technology would be the newly reformed Neomads, which Caesar Clown and Vinsmoke founded to take revenge on Vegapunk. That goal is now no longer possible. And also, we have a much bigger problem to deal with, which is the impending flood of the world. Caesar and Judge aren't the most palatable of people, but I'm sure they do have an interest in their own survival, and would perhaps be willing to work alongside Lilith, maybe a clone Stussy, and perhaps even a potential son of Queen, Franky, to form a full-scale Neomads. Or they could just get Queen himself. I'm sure he's not particularly busy at the moment. Queen and Judge can probably bond over what a prick Sanji is, and there's already a bit of a friendly in. But I do really like the idea of Mads as an organization that was torn apart by its internal politics, coming back together and putting aside their differences in order to manifest the will of their former colleague, Dr. Vegapunk. And going back to Franky, the true focus of this video, his story will not end with the conclusion of One Piece, because the spirit of Tom combined with the skills and technology of Dr. Vegapunk mean that his potential to have an impact on this world is near infinite. And don't forget to check out Civ Ratcon, who came up with the foundation of this video. I'm sure there's a lot of other great ideas on that channel as well, so do it if you want. If not, check out another one of my videos, and I'm not complaining. Prince Loki is a good boy, but he's acting evil in order to protect the citizens of Elbaf, and all of this was set up by King Harold and, of all people, Mother Carmel. And I think that what we're in for is another classic One Piece tragedy as we discover the sacrifice made by Loki for the sake of his people. So let's talk about the initial impression of Prince Loki, which may have been designed to deliberately misguide us. Because going back on Loki's introduction, there is something very sneaky that I should point out, which is that our initial impression of Loki is set up long before we actually meet him, because a few pages previous, a giant dude says, "The king had another official child known as the Accursed Prince. He committed all manner of evil acts and was sentenced to crucifixion a few years back, but nearly escaped his punishment. It took all of our warriors to get him under control. His desperate desire for a legendary devil fruit passed down through the Elbaf royal line led him to kill his father, King Harold, and eat the fruit. The next time that Loki, the accursed prince is unleashed, the world will be brought to ruin. He is the shame of Elbaf. And these words are a very clever thing for Oda to do, because the words of this giant are priming us for Loki. Regardless of who Loki actually is in fictional reality, our introduction to him was colored by these words, some of those words being evil, accursed, punishment, ruin, shame, etc. So many bad things. So when we do actually meet Loki, that's what we're expecting. And because Loki doesn't present an immediate contrast to this, we assign all of those values to Loki regardless of whether or not it's accurate. Loki introduced himself as a resident of Warland, which once lived and breathed warfare. Loki, the sun god who brings the world to an end, which admittedly does sound quite intimidating and a bit not good, and so it gives the illusion of confirming everything that we heard about him earlier in the same chapter. These words about warfare, being a god, and ending the world make it very easy to assign values like evil, accursed, and shame. However, Loki hasn't actually said or done anything to confirm those values. And this is the same sort of principle as why social media, and in fact media in general, can be quite dangerous. Because if you hear someone state that this person over here that you've never met is evil, then you're going to be viewing all of that person that you've never met's actions and statements through that lens of evil, whether you realize it or not. Someone else has colored your perception. And while that's a bit of a concerning issue in the real world, no one cares about that because it's story time now. And in the story realm, this is a simple but incredible tool for writers to use to mislead their readers. And I personally bought into it. Those two initial Loki chapters had me 90-something% convinced that he was going to be the major antagonist of this arc. And in retrospect, that was a colored conclusion because I wasn't judging Loki. I was judging the words of this guy, who according to the One Piece wiki is named Quintuple ? So for now, we'll just call him Mark for short, but this dude doesn't even have a real name yet. He may as well have been a completely anonymous Reddit poster, and yet his words shaped my entire view of Loki. And I'm sure that Mark means well, but in situations like this, we should be looking for a more reliable source, and we do have one. Because our future pirate king may not know how to navigate, but when it comes to people, his moral compass is more finely tuned than anyone else in this world. And the one thing that did consistently give me pause for thought with Loki is how comfortable Luffy is around him. And I mean this quite literally. When they met, Luffy decided to casually and comfortably lie down on Loki, and in many ways it's a lot easier to look at Luffy from the perspective of being a wild animal than a human. He mainly operates on instincts and vibes. And here Luffy wasn't just comfortable with Loki, but he actually deliberately sought Loki out when he felt his presence on the bridge. So to Luffy, Loki actually possesses an attractive quality, something that makes others want to be around him, which is a trait that Luffy himself has. The ability that Dracula Mihawk once called the most dangerous in the world. So we can add that to the pile of Luffy-Loki similarities. But for a man imprisoned in the underworld, Loki has a very active social life and a long list of allies. In chapter 1131, it's revealed that Loki has a legion of colossal animal loyalists who Luffy makes friends with instantly, but who Loki also describes as friends. And we really should not ignore any use of the F word. Most traditional bad guys don't tend to use the word friend, especially when it comes to animals. It's more something along the lines of, these are my underlings, these are my beasts. And given that Loki's friends are the same animals from One Piece Strong World, it's worth stating that Golden Lion Shiki only ever spoke of these animals as tools, which is the standard One Piece bad guy way to view the existence of others. This is a very simplistic way to view things, but it does work more often than not with One Piece. If a character is able to form a genuine friendship with an animal, then they tend to be more on the good side of the spectrum. Think of characters like Vivian, Karoo, Brook and Laboon, Konus and Sue, Gaimon, and all of his weird friends. There aren't that many antagonists who have that sort of camaraderie with an animal. And if they do have animals, it's more to use them like the Arlong pirates did with Momu and like the Caribou pirates did with Momu again. But not only that, it isn't just animals. Loki also has a group of human followers in the underworld, which he describes as follows. Those other little ones are humans who chose to do battle with Elbaf. They wear stinking robes to turn away the ravenous beasts, but they only delay the inevitable. They are corpses already. And to these rather harsh words, Loki's followers respond with, "Now that's really uncalled for, sir," which is a pretty hilarious response to being called a corpse, and it gives me the impression that Loki was acting when he described his human followers, and that the human followers know Loki well enough to know that what he's saying isn't actually how he feels. It's almost as if Loki needs to maintain a certain appearance appearance with Luffy or a certain appearance in general, one that we now know is almost certainly a facade. But again, Loki is portrayed as less of an underworld prisoner and more of a Disney princess. He seems to attract friends and allies from every direction, even those who aren't able to be here physically, as we discover in chapter 1134, which came with a pretty big translation gap between the scans and the official, and the gap in question did unfortunately occur during Loki's section when he's on the snail phone to either Mossa or Shaggy, depending on which translation you read. The official translation went with Shaggy, which is a bit, zoink Scoob, but it's probably about as well as this could have been translated, because Mossa Mossa is an onomatopoeia that's often used to refer to someone who is excessively hairy, shaggy, and is generally not well put together. And so there's an overall impression of poor hygiene and personal grooming. And part of this definitely comes across because the Denden Mushi is projecting quite a hairy fella on the other end. However, something that gets completely lost in the official translation is that Loki uses an honorific in this conversation. He refers to Shaggy or Mossa as Mossa Ko, and there's been a lot of internet linguists looking into this honorific because it's quite unusual. And what they have discovered is that Ko is an antiquated honorific used for ye old nobility, and the conclusion from here is that this Mossa that Loki is speaking to is part of some royal family. Not necessarily on Elbaf, however, the interpretation of native Japanese speakers is completely different. To native speakers, the Ko honorific seems to be used in a more mocking way, in the same sort of way that we would sarcastically refer to someone as sire or my lord. It's not something that you would take seriously, but it is hard to tell which case it is because Elbaf is a land that is very much trapped back in time, and a lot of the other giants do have other antiquated ways of speaking. So Loki could be talking to someone of royal lineage, or he could be giving someone a cute ironic nickname. And actually, if you're familiar with Hachiko, also known as the greatest dog to have ever lived and who inspired Oda to create Choo Choo, he is a perfect example of this. The Ko in Hachiko is this honorific. But regardless, for an evil being, king murdering, ruin wanting, shame bringing incarnate of pure destruction, Loki sure does have a lot of friends, doesn't he? And that's because deep down, Loki has a bit of the K word going on, as Mossa and or Shaggy stated. I've recently realized that those fearsome words of yours hide your kindness. And now Loki didn't take kindly to this accusation of kindness, and we'll get to that shortly. But firstly, we don't know how long Loki has been speaking to his long-distance friend. However, it's likely to have been at least a few years at this point, and it took all of that time for Loki's friend to realize that his strong, powerful, brutal words are acting as a shroud to his kindness. But that's something that Luffy realized immediately. Luffy wasn't bothered by any of Loki's words, except for what he said about Shanks, but otherwise it didn't matter how vividly horrible Loki's descriptions were or how volatile his threats were. Luffy's mind just translated all of that as, hey, Straw Hat Man, wanna be friends? Which is why he's apparently gone on to make a deal with Loki and is keeping it a secret in the same way that small children do. So I think the good guy Loki is becoming a pretty solid thought. But it does come with three very important questions to answer. Firstly, even after having said all of this, Loki does appear to have a genuine hatred for the concept of kindness, so we need to figure out why that is. Secondly, and this could be connected to the first part, but we need to establish why Loki does verbally portray himself in the most unfriendly and apocalyptic of ways. And finally, and potentially most difficultly, you know what? I'm not doing it again. We're sticking with difficultly. We need to explain why Loki killed his father, Harold, because that's probably the biggest obstacle in the good guy Loki hypothesis. But let's start with kindness. This is the one aspect of Loki that I can confidently say is not an act. He has a solid hatred of kindness, and initially I thought that this could have something to do with the Lola situation, because from what we've seen of the vaguely shaped Loki of this time, he was a much happier, gentler individual, and his aversion to kindness may have to do with Lola's rejection of him. The idea is that Loki was as kind as he could possibly be, and that's what left him open, that's what left him vulnerable to being hurt the most, which would be a pretty big blow to the strongest warriorman of Elbaf. For all of his muscle and battle power, he was unable to protect his heart from being broken. However, I don't think that's it, and if it is, I don't think it's everything. I guess it could definitely be a part of it, a greater theme as to why Loki despises kindness, but we should actually look back a little further, because one of the kindest people we've ever been introduced to in One Piece was Mother Carmel, the lovable saint who dedicated her life to others and ran an orphanage on Elbaf where nothing bad ever happened at all. And look, if it did, it certainly didn't have anything to do with child trafficking. Mother Carmel is the perfect illustration of the danger of kindness, because being kind is almost universally seen as a positive value. But people who are overly kind can be taken advantage of, or they can take advantage of others with that kindness if they so desired, which is exactly what Carmel did. She used her kindness as a poison pill to set up and manage her business of selling children to the world government. However, that is not the only influence that Carmel had on this world, and we may be seeing Carmel's legacy playing out on Elbaf as we speak. So to be clear, Loki was born in the same year that Carmel died. So this aversion to kindness or faux kindness would not have been caused by her directly. However, there is another almost sickeningly beloved individual on this island known as the late King Harold, the one that Loki allegedly murdered, and King Harold has been credited as the one who changed Elbaf and brought it into a new age with the philosophy of, quote, don't fight with other countries, trade with them, which is a lovely idea. I like it a lot, but it wasn't Harold's idea, it was Carmel's idea. In Big Mom's flashback, Charles says, Carmel's ideas about trade over plunder are all well and good, but we must not forget that we are warriors, which is a line that comes back to smack us right in the sabos in chapter 1134, because it appears that King Harold adopted Carmel's philosophy. Now, being as generous as I can be, this means that Carmel accidentally set Elbaf on the path to peace, that her horrid existence did actually have a surprisingly positive impact in the world. However, to be as not generous as I can, perhaps being taken in by Carmel's words implies that King Harold was on a bit of a similar wavelength to Carmel, and him adopting her philosophy could indicate that the kind, benevolent, and universally beloved King Harold may have been none of those things it is that I just said, and was another figure abusing kindness for his own very unkind goals. And this is the faux kindness that Loki would have been exposed to. And I would propose that one day Loki discovered what Harold's plans were. He saw his father, the truth of his father, for the first time, and on that day he realized that everything Harold presented himself to be was a lie. And as for what Harold's end goal could have been, one idea is working with the world government to demilitarize Elbaf, as it is the last army in the world that the world government actually fears, and King Harold may have been planning to sell his own people for whatever benefits the world government offered him, much like York did with Egghead Island. So Loki discovers this, and as a man who doesn't like bad things, he wants to put a stop to it, which resulted in the death of King Harold. I say death because I'm not 100% convinced that Loki actually killed him. Oda likes to keep his protagonist pretty undisputedly pure, and if Loki is a good guy after all, then I think there's going to be more to this Harold incident than we've been led to believe. Something that keeps Loki's hands clean, but this could also explain why Loki is doing absolutely nothing at all to try and prove his innocence. Because Loki saw how kindness was abused, and he decided to go in the exact opposite direction, to become a villain worthy of fear. And when I say that, I mean to be feared by the world government, thus resulting in his special bounty of 2.6 billion berries, but also resulting in the protection of Elbaf. As if Loki's very existence is giving the giants of Elbaf a reason to stay strong, something that ensures they will never completely demilitarize and embrace 100% peace, because at any point the demonic Loki could escape the underworld and destroy them all. So they need to be strong and ready in the event that he does, and that strength is what stops the world government coming in and taking Elbaf for themselves. It's slightly complicated, but this is also very classic One Piece. The idea of a tragic figure putting up this villainous act for years for the sake of his people. Other notable examples of this could include Kozuki Oden, who danced Neiki for 5 years for the sake of the people of Wano, or Bartholomew Kuma embracing the role of a tyrant for Jewelry Bonnie, or even the Kokoyashi villagers acting like they hated Nami in order to give her an opportunity to flee and be safe without worrying about them. And even without that established framing, One Piece does have a rather well-established trope of island citizens hating the person most looking out for their best interests, such as the people of Alabasta rising up against King Cobra, or the hatred of King Riku on Dressrosa after Doflamingo framed him, or say Hody Jones rallying support against King Neptune, and so on and so forth. It happens a lot, so it wouldn't be surprising if it's happening again, because it's a very powerful device. Transmuting a character's desire to protect their people into hatred directed at them from the people, and then further transmuting that into tragedy when everyone realizes what fools they've been and what that person has suffered through this entire time. time. Because other than this Harold incident, we still have yet to see or hear evidence of Loki even harming another giant. Because remember the words of Mark? The king had another official child, known as the Accursed Prince. He committed all manner of evil acts and was sentenced to crucifixion a few years back, but nearly escaped his punishment. It took all of our warriors to get him under control. And a lot of people interpreted that as Loki attacking the giants as the bad, evil man he is. But to me, it sounds more like Loki tried to escape and the rest of the giants went after him. And even Loki's offer to Luffy to destroy a pirate crew can be seen in quite a moral way. Loki doesn't offer to destroy just anyone. He specifies that it has to be the kind of people who are generally considered the criminals of the world. But there is one thing that's stopping me from fully converting to the good guy Loki hypothesis, which is that he did say that the first thing he was going to do after being released would be to kill Luffy. And he didn't say this out loud. This was a thought, so I can't claim that he's acting on this one. And sure, it could be an exaggeration. In English, we do that all the time. It's a bit weird when you think about it, but saying that you're gonna kill someone is a fairly common way of describing how very upset you are with them. So look, it's not 100% yet, but with every chapter of Elbaf, it's looking like this Loki business is not as simple as it initially seemed. And in 2025, what we could be seeing is the redemption of Prince Loki. Here's everything that's going to happen in One Piece in 2025 according to you, person watching me on the internet right now whilst probably doing the dishes or something productive. That's right, another year has begun and so it is time for our annual predictions. And this tradition started out really well. We absolutely nailed it the first year we did it and then never again. But this is where we take your predictions for what's going to happen in One Piece in 2025 and slot them into a Bing card, except this year, mate, we have a twist. Because I have gone all out, I've spent ever so much money to upgrade this 4x4 into a 5x5, a proper bingo card. Previously we called it Bing because we didn't have enough space for the O. How far we've come. So here are the 25 things that will definitely happen in One Piece according to you. And look, what I often do with these videos is hide behind your predictions and then laugh mockingly in your general direction when they don't come true. But we're going to kick this year off a bit differently because I am going to plonk my nuts in the vice alongside you guys and give my top 5 predictions for the bingo card. With my first prediction being that Elbaf will not end in 2025, because here's what we can realistically hope for. Currently, the trend is that each new year brings approximately 33 new One Piece chapters, and we're currently less than 10 chapters into the arc. So unless Oda pulls something really out of left field, I think we're spending all year on this island at least. I don't think we're even beginning the discussion of getting off Elbaf until 2026. And I'm so confident about this that we're going to put this prediction in the middle square, which was traditionally known as the free square. And I'm also going to follow this up by saying that next year will also give us the reveal of the late King Harold, probably in a flashback, unless Oda decides to show us his rotting corpse. And he's not the only one, because what Oda's going to do right is he is going to unzip the metaphorical pants of Elbaf and also reveal the long-awaited figure who was drinking with Crocus. We know he's on this island, and currently it's being assumed that he's Colin's father, but all I'm predicting is that he's going to be revealed, and we're going to know who he is. And that might seem like an easy prediction, and that's why I picked it. For my personal third prediction, I think that 2025 will also bring us the end of the Yamato cover story. We're currently 21 pages into it, and I will say that this one is definitely not a guarantee, because going by the past cover stories which have reached into the 40s, it is possible that Yamato's cover story will extend into 2026. Because one thing a lot of people forget is that Oda draws a lot of color spreads in any given year, so many more than most other artists. In 2024, he drew 7 color spreads, and those color spreads, they take the place of the cover story. So it might be tight, but I'm gonna plonk Yamato cover story ends on the bingo board. And for the final of my personal 5, this is gonna go a bit out on a limb, but I think that 2025 may bring us a Shanks flashback. To be clear, I don't mean a fully fleshed out 4 to 8 chapter flashback Shanks. I don't mean that. I'm just going to move on. But I do think that the appearance of Figgle and Frank on Elbaf is going to open the door to some Shanks content from the past, even if it's only a page or a couple of panels. And I have one very strict rule with this, which is that it doesn't count if it's a flashback we've already seen. Like if it's Luffy reminiscing about, oh, the magnificent Shanks giving me Pirate Boy the straw hat for the billionth time, then that's a cop-out. That does not count. That sort of thing is completely unacceptable in fictional pirate bingo. But Shanks flashback is now on the card, and I've I've tried to space all of mine out so they don't synergize with each other, but the next 20 squares are going to be filled with your predictions, starting with Shanks's evil twin shall get named. So currently I've already named him. I'm calling him Figgle Frank because I like rhymes, but he's also being referred to as Figgle Shiv, which I quite like as well. But I think that this is also a very reasonable prediction, and I would be shocked and aghast if we went through 2025 without learning this guy's name. And next up we have Big Nika Law Drops, brackets, not Joy Boy, full stop, Nika, many exclamation marks, and a closed bracket, which is a distinction that I like because they are two different entities, and while I think that Egghead Island gave us a nice window into the life of Joy Boy, very dirty window where we couldn't see particularly much, but it was still better than what we had before. While I think that, what I hope for with Elbaf is that this is going to be more of a focus on the sun god as an entity, because Nika is one of their deities. And Ripley even said it, she wants to see Luffy in his white-haired form. All of the giants are ever so excited to see it because they all know what it means and we don't. And so I do think there's a lot of potential for a Nika Law drop in 2025. Not Joy Boy. If there's Joy Boy Law, then that's great, but it's not going to be enough to clear this square unless it's both Nika and Joy Boy at the same time somehow. But your next prediction is that Dragon does nothing yet again. So usually on the bingo cards, we put Dragon makes a move, and it has burned us each and every time. And I like that you've all learned from this. So this year, we're gonna mix it up and bet the house on Dragon not making a move yet again. I think that this is probably the safer way to go. Old mate's probably gonna spend all year looking east again, or maybe opening a lovely bottle of wine. However, now that we've put this on the bingo card, watch this be the year where he finally does something. And look, if so, I'm gonna call that a victory as well, because we may lose the bingo, but what we will gain is a modicum of activity from this character. But also, we'll get an actual flashback to when Loki proposed to Lola. So this is a very specific prediction, but I like it a lot. 2025 will probably be the year of opening up the messy box that is Loki, and a big part of that is the Lola proposal, which we have seen briefly in vague silhouette form before. But I think that seeing both it and the subsequent rejection in clarity would be fantastic. And what would also be fantastic is Luffy and fake Shanks will fight. I mean, maybe it won't happen. Frank might not end up being the big boss antagonist of Elbaf, and we might put him in the fridge for later, but the opportunity is right there. Even if it's just a brief skirmish, the idea that Oda would allow Luffy versus the facade of Shanks to slip through his ink-soaked fingers would baffle readers for generations to come. For this not to happen, Frank would need to turn out to be a good guy after all, which seems very unlikely, but hey, I did say that about Loki as well the first time we met him, and my opinion on that has changed significantly a lot. Or Oda structures Elbaf in such a way that Luffy and Frank never meet, which would also be maybe unsatisfying because I want to see Luffy seeing this man who looks like Shanks. And then the funniest possible opportunity, I want to stress this, probably would never happen, but what if Luffy mistook Frank and tried to give him the straw hat, claiming that he was now a great pirate and they'd fulfilled the agreement. And then Frank just Luke Skywalkers the hat off into the distance, absolutely disgusted that he had to touch the garb of the masses. And at this stage, I should say that all of the viewer submissions were randomized on this card, and I think I'm kind of regretting that now, because column 1 and row 2 are looking very Shanks heavy, so we're betting an awful lot on Scarlet-headed storytelling this year, and we're not stopping there because our next one is the return of Eustace Kid. Whether he's on Elbaf or not, I just want to see where he is currently in the story. I mean, we could go on ignoring him and the fact that he and his crew were obliterated just off the coast of where we're all partying and having fun without him right now. But of all of the Worst Generation members, Eustace Kid is, I think, the most likely to show up this year, aside from Killer, but the two of them usually come as a special package deal, like a super sharp knife to cut into a particularly thick piece of meat that never learned its lesson about attacking various emperors of the sea head on. Bad meat, bad. And I also think it's very possible that Kid has been imprisoned in the underworld. That is unless Shanks was environmentally conscious and decided to take his trash with him. But also coming up for us, we learn who the man with the burn scar is. So this one is a carryover from last year's bingo. In fact, this evil square was the one that stopped us from getting a bingo, and it may screw us over once more this year, because what I believe this is betting on is that the man who is drinking with Crocus is the burn scar dude, because he does feasibly fit. It's not like he's permanently on Elbaf. He's clearly been traveling around and potentially guarding the final road poneglyph. But if it isn't him, then I think we're in a bit of trouble with this one. And it's going to become a brick square doing nothing except weighing us down on our quest to predict a pirate comic. Will we'll find out why we shouldn't linger on Elbaf for too long. So this is referring to a warning from author Louis Arnault in chapter 1132. Let this be a word of warning. Do not overstay your welcome here, and it is possible that this warning will become clear when all of the stuff starts to go down, and perhaps our giant hospitality will turn into inhospitable behavior, or whatever this message was referring to. I think this one is a bit of a gamble as well, because it's one of those things that may not pay off until the end of the arc, which I don't think will be in 2025, or it could even be a situation like Marco's message to Luffy, where it never really mattered in the first place, and we literally threw it away. Dunno, but I would like to think that a dramatic chapter ending like that would go on to have a payoff. Even if it's just comical, it doesn't need to be dramatic. Like maybe the next line is, because you'll never want to leave, and then a giantess will try to breed you. Oh no. And speaking of breeding, the return of Arouge. So a lot of people suggested this one, as they did last year, and I still think it's an okay option. Right now, we've barely begun Elbaf, so there's no telling who's gonna show up, only that the cast is gonna keep growing and growing, as does Arouge, and he is the final Worst Generation member to be explored. Everyone else has had a lot of time in the New World arc, some more than others, but everyone more so than Arouge who hasn't even been involved in a current arc yet. So one Arouge, please. And next up, Loki will become an ally. I'll keep this one brief because I speak about good guy Loki a lot these days, but I do think this will happen. I'm just not sure if it'll be in 2025. At the moment, Loki is still keeping up his villain act. If it is indeed an act, he might just be a villain. But if he isn't, it's gonna take some time to break that, and fighting alongside Loki seems more like an arc climax idea. I'd feel a bit safer putting this in 2026, but we do have 33 chapters, and if we dig real deep into Loki during that time, then maybe we could make it happen. Something really interesting is that I don't think I saw a single person predict Luffy versus Loki. The Grand Fleet seems very sold on him becoming an ally now, but even if he does come over to us eventually, there's nothing stopping an initial clash like a Luffy versus Frankie. But all of you people who are much more intelligenter than I have spoken. Mark my words, Colin will do something big. Consider your words marked. At the moment, Colin seems to be set up for a role along the lines of Momonosuke or Tama, maybe something in between, or maybe something completely different. Whatever it turns out to be, he is clearly important because Oda has given him the Vicky the Viking design, one of Oda's favorite childhood shows. And in general, it's a pretty safe bet that if there's a child in a Kingdom arc, they're probably going to be getting a lot of focus and act as the heart of the arc. So I'm on board for Colin doing something big, which are very vague words. And I guess I'll define it as Colin has to do something that has a tangible impact on the story. Something that would not have happened without him doing it, which again is potentially risky because it seems more like an arc climax action as we saw with Momonosuke and Onigashima, as well as Tama converting all the smile users. And I'm also slightly nervous about this next one. We'll see Cross Guild make its first move towards claiming the One Piece. So during Oda's Jump Festa message, he did mention that things would be happening all over the world. And part of that world does contain Cross Guild, so it is feasible that we'll cut away from Elbaf to explore these worldly events like what happened on Egghead. But to me, Cross Guild feel more like an endgame group, although to be fair, Shanks has already declared that he was going to claim the One Piece after Wano, and I would consider that sort of thing acceptable, even if it's just a quick page of Buggy and Crocodile shouting, "Yar, it's time," and then setting sail. No way any of them would ever say Yar, but it's risky. However, so many of you said this or a variation on this that surely it has to happen. You can't be wrong, right? Or at the very least, I can't ignore the will of the people, so here it is. Bounties will be increased for all Straw Hats. This is another potentially crazy one. I mean, it makes logical sense. After Egghead Island and just how publicly Monkey D. Luffy and friends of Monkey D. Luffy demolished the world government and were subsequently blamed for killing Dr. Vegapunk, it is beyond comprehension that their bounties wouldn't increase. But my only question is, will we see that happen before Elbaf concludes, or will we discover what the new bounties are after we've dealt with the story on this island? And I don't have the answer to that question, so I'm just gonna do what I'm told and again put my faith in all of you. Don't let me down. Loki escapes. Alright, this is a good one. I'm comfortable with this. We've got 33 chapters, so surely we are going to get to the point where someone frees Loki and One Piece Ragnarok begins. Very simple. I would be amazed if he was still in chains by this time next year. Zoro gets lost. Also very simple. I like it. I like it because this isn't some huge plot event. It's just thinking about the inevitable. We're on the largest island we'll ever be on, which gives Zoro infinitely more opportunities to get lost. It would be insane if this was the one island where they managed to keep him in check the entire time. We will see Garling's transformation, and by this I assume it means new abilities granted by Emu. Although if Garling was, say, a secret Zoan fruit user, then I'd also accept that. But look, if someone had told me at the beginning of 2024 that we would see all 5 Elder Stars and their transformations, I would have thought that was out of the question. So I'm not keeping anything off the table with Garling, especially in what may turn out to be a very Figaland-centric arc. A flashback on what actually happened to Loki. This is fairly self-explanatory. I also believe it's fairly likely. If Oda kept us in the shadows for another 30 plus chapters about Loki, then that would mean that Elbaf might end up being as long as Wano. Because it did take us an awfully long time to see Kozuki Oden's flashback, about 2 years of publishing to get to it. So if we don't see Loki's flashback in 2025, then not being able to clear it on our bingo board is probably going to be one of the lesser spoken about topics of Elbaf. Giant Gear 5 has to return this year. All on board with this? Even if it's just Luffy screwing around, because Gear 5th, it isn't strictly a combat form, it's just Luffy being his most free. But whatever it is, on the island of the giants, we have to see a giant Luffy, and I would like that giant Luffy as soon as humanly possible, please. The Alabasta crew will see the newspaper article and realize where Vivi is. So there were a lot of Vivi suggestions, and they were all something along these lines. This refers to the article published following the Egghead incident, where Luffy was given an X on his arm, which Robin did note as strange. And to us, it's a clear message from Vivi. However, Robin doesn't know that because she wasn't part of the crew at the time and never saw the X marks. But if they still have the newspaper, then Chopper might see it in the Owl Library, because it'll get all big and Chopper will go, whoa, what's that massive X? But then realize, I know what it is. But this could also be more of an end of arc revelation, something that gives the crew a sense of where to go next. However, as for where we go next, here is our final prediction of 2025, and it's a pretty big one. An important character will die in the Elbaf arc, which is always a bold prediction to make in One Piece. I believe a lot of people are currently thinking that Saul may actually die for real this time, and there's a lot of morbid thoughts floating around in general, although I can't blame them, because Saint Saturn did die this year in a pretty gruesome way, so it's very possible. And we do need to stress the word important. It can't just be a background civilian or collateral damage elsewhere. I would say that it needs to be a named character. A named character needs to die. And there's nothing stopping that from happening off screen either. Like if we hear news from the outside of shocking events that have occurred, or on the off chance that it even happens in Yamato's cover story. But that gives us the full 2025 Grand Line Review bingo board. We've got more predictions than ever this time. Some of them I think are 99.9% guaranteed, whereas others are complete wildcard suggestions that could make or break the next glorious year of fictional pirate consumption.